December 22, 1849. Semyonovsky Square, St. Petersburg. The snow crunches beneath 21 pairs of boots as the condemned men are led to their positions. Among them walks Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky, 28 years old, his breath visible in the -20 air. His hands shake not from cold, but from the knowledge that in minutes, perhaps seconds, his consciousness will cease to exist. The soldiers arrange themselves in formation. Dostoevsky can count the rifle barrels, 7 pointing directly at him. He notices absurd details. A loose button on one soldier's coat, the way morning light catches ice crystals on his executioner's mustache, the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears like artillery. This hyper-awareness of sensory detail, this desperate cataloging of final perceptions, will later become the signature of his literary style. He thinks of his unfinished novel, the manuscripts hidden in his apartment, all those words, those attempts to capture human nature, about to die with him. The irony strikes him. He has spent years trying to understand the psychology of criminals, and now he himself stands condemned as a political criminal, guilty of reading forbidden literature, of discussing dangerous ideas about social justice and human dignity. Behind the rifles, an officer raises his sword. This is the moment. Dostoevsky closes his eyes and thinks of his brother Mikhail, of their childhood reading Don Quixote by candlelight. He remembers the exact texture of the book's pages, the weight of it in his small hands. If these are his final thoughts, let them be of literature, of the human imagination's power to transcend suffering. The sword descends, but the rifles do not fire. Instead, drums roll, not the drums of execution, but of imperial mercy. A messenger gallops into the square, waving a parchment. Tsar Nicholas I has commuted their sentences. The mock execution was theater, designed to break their spirits before sending them to Siberian labor camps. Dostoevsky opens his eyes and discovers he is still alive. The world appears transformed, hyper-real, pregnant with meaning. The same snow that moments ago seemed like his shroud now sparkles with impossible beauty. He will later write, to live. What bliss it is to be alive. But this rebirth comes with a terrible knowledge. He has stared directly into the abyss of human cruelty, has felt the weight of absolute powerlessness, has experienced the moment when hope dies. What Dostoevsky could not have known, standing in that square with death-heightened senses, was that this mock execution would become the foundational trauma of his artistic vision. Every character he would create, Raskolnikov, the underground man, Ivan Karamazov, would carry within them the same proximity to annihilation, the same desperate hunger for meaning in a universe that seemed designed for suffering. The young men who walked into Semyonovsky Square, believing in rational social progress, walked out understanding something far darker, that human nature contained depths of cruelty and contradiction that no social theory could explain. This knowledge would torment him for the rest of his life. It would also make him the greatest psychological novelist who ever lived. But to understand how a death sentence shaped a literary genius, we must begin 4 decades earlier, in a Moscow military hospital, where a different kind of suffering was about to give birth to extraordinary empathy. Moscow, 1821. In the charity ward of Mariinsky Hospital, Dr. Mikhail Andreevich Dostoevsky tends to patients who cannot afford private care, peasants, servants, the urban poor whose bodies bear the accumulated damage of Russian serfdom. The hospital smells of carbolic acid and unwashed flesh, of suffering that has found institutional form. Here, among the dying and destitute, the future father of Russia's greatest psychological novelist learned his first lessons about human endurance. Dr. Dostoevsky was a complicated man, devoutly religious yet prone to volcanic rages, compassionate toward his patients yet tyrannical with his children. He had married above his station. Maria Fyodorovna came from a merchant family with pretensions to nobility, and the social insecurity gnawed at him. He dreamed of purchasing an estate, of escaping medicine for the genteel life of a landowner. But these dreams required money he didn't possess. The contradiction between aspiration and reality created a household atmosphere of perpetual tension, where love and cruelty intertwined in ways that would prove prophetic. Into this world was born Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky on November 11, 1821. From his earliest moments, he was surrounded by the sounds of suffering, patients crying out in the hospital wards below their apartment, his father's frustrated outbursts, his mother's quiet weeping over the family's precarious finances. The infant's first sensory experiences were of a world where pain was inescapable, where human dignity struggled against overwhelming forces, where even acts of healing carried undertones of violence. Yet this was also a household devoted to literature. While Maria Fyodorovna was often ill, tuberculosis was slowly consuming her lungs. She read to her children with passionate intensity. Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, Gogol's Dead Souls, Dickens' novels in French translation. These stories became Fyodor's refuge from domestic volatility. When the real world proved too harsh, he could escape into fictional worlds where suffering had meaning, where character was revealed through crisis, where even the most degraded souls contained sparks of transcendence. The young Dostoevsky was a peculiar child, intensely intelligent but socially awkward, deeply religious but fascinated by sin, physically frail but emotionally dramatic. He would spend hours alone, creating elaborate fantasy worlds populated by characters more vivid than his actual schoolmates. Teachers noted his exceptional memory and his disturbing tendency to identify with outcasts and criminals in literature. While other children played normal games, Fyodor would reenact scenes from books, always choosing to play the villain or the victim, never the hero. This preference for exploring psychological extremes revealed something crucial about his developing artistic vision. Even as a child, Dostoevsky understood that human nature was most clearly revealed not in moments of conventional virtue, but in moments of breakdown, confession, and moral crisis. He was drawn to characters who suffered magnificently, who transformed pain into insight, who discovered spiritual truth through psychological torture. The family's financial situation remained precarious throughout his childhood. Dr. Dostoevsky's dreams of purchasing an estate remained just that, dreams that grew more desperate as the children grew older and expenses mounted. Maria Fyodorovna's health continued to deteriorate, creating a household atmosphere where death was an ever-present possibility. Young Fyodor learned to read adult moods with preternatural sensitivity, developing the psychological acuity that would later make him literature's most penetrating analyst of human motivation. But perhaps the most formative aspect of his childhood was witnessing his father's attempts to maintain dignity while trapped in circumstances beyond his control. Dr. Dostoevsky's rage at his social position, his oscillation between tenderness and brutality, his desperate attempts to impose order on chaos, all of this would reappear decades later in characters like Fyodor Karamazov, like the underground man, like every Dostoevsky protagonist torn between noble aspirations and ignoble realities. By age 10, Fyodor had developed the core psychological patterns that would define his life and work: an almost mystical empathy for suffering, a fascination with moral extremes, a tendency toward self-punishment, and an unshakable belief that literature could transform pain into meaning. He did not yet know that these patterns were preparing him to become the voice of an entire civilization's spiritual crisis. What he did know, with the clarity that sometimes comes to sensitive children in troubled households, was that ordinary life was insufficient. Reality needed to be pushed to its breaking point before it revealed its essential truths. This knowledge would prove both his gift and his curse. Chapter 1. Haunted Origins. The ghost that would haunt Fyodor Dostoevsky's entire life first appeared when he was 16. Maria Fyodorovna's coughing had grown worse through the winter of 1837, each spasm racking her increasingly frail frame with violence that seemed to exceed what flesh could endure. The tuberculosis was winning its patient war, dissolving her lungs drop by drop, breath by painful breath. In the cramped apartment above the hospital wards, death had taken residence and was slowly, methodically, claiming its prize. Fyodor watched his mother die with the intensity of a scholar memorizing sacred text. Every grimace, every struggle for air, every moment when pain briefly transformed her face into something unrecognizable, he catalogued it all with disturbing precision. This was not morbid curiosity, but something deeper, a recognition that suffering contained information, that observing agony closely enough might reveal essential truths about human existence that could not be learned any other way. When Maria Fyodorovna finally died on February 27, 1837, the household's emotional architecture collapsed. Dr. Dostoevsky, already prone to violent mood swings, began drinking heavily. Without his wife's moderating influence, his rage found new targets: the servants, the patients, and especially his children. Fyodor learned to read his father's footsteps on the stairs, to distinguish between the measured tread of sobriety and the irregular rhythm of drunken fury approaching. The family's financial situation, never stable, became catastrophic. Dr. Dostoevsky's dreams of purchasing an estate now seemed like cruel jokes. They could barely afford rent on their Moscow rooms. The social insecurity that had always tormented him metastasized into a consuming obsession. He began to see insults and slights everywhere, became convinced that colleagues were plotting against him, that patients were ungrateful, that the world had conspired to deny him the respect he deserved. For Fyodor, his mother's death created a psychological wound that would never fully heal. She had been his primary source of affection in a household dominated by his father's unpredictable volatility. More importantly, she had been his guide to literature, his introduction to the power of imagination to transcend immediate suffering. Her death felt like the murder of beauty itself, the victory of cruelty over compassion, of chaos over the fragile order that art might impose on existence. Yet this trauma also awakened something unprecedented, an almost supernatural empathy for others who suffered. Walking through Moscow's streets, the 16-year-old Dostoevsky found himself drawn to beggars, prostitutes, the drunk and dispossessed. Their pain called to something in him that conventional social boundaries could not contain. He began giving away money the family could not afford, bringing home stray animals and homeless children, much to his father's fury. This compulsive identification with society's outcasts revealed the emergence of his mature artistic vision. Where others saw degradation, he perceived complex inner lives worthy of literary attention. A drunken woman in a tavern was not merely fallen but tragically noble. A beggar was not simply poor but spiritually rich in ways that prosperous society could not understand. This inverted moral vision, this ability to find holiness in degradation, would become the foundation of all his great novels. Dr. Dostoevsky, meanwhile, had decided that his sons needed military education to prepare them for stable careers. In 1838, he enrolled both Fyodor and his brother Mikhail at Nikolaev Military Engineering Institute in St. Petersburg. For Fyodor, leaving Moscow felt like exile from everything that had given his life meaning. The rigid discipline of military school, the emphasis on mathematical precision over imaginative exploration, the complete absence of literature from daily life, all of this struck him as a form of spiritual death. At the institute, Dostoevsky proved academically competent, but socially disastrous. He was too intense, too willing to discuss philosophical questions that made his classmates uncomfortable, too obviously different from the straightforward young men training to become military engineers. His instructors noted his exceptional intelligence, but worried about his emotional instability, his tendency toward dramatic outbursts, his apparent inability to accept authority without internal rebellion. During these lonely months in St. Petersburg, Dostoevsky's letters home revealed a young man in the grip of existential crisis. He wrote to his brother Mikhail about feeling trapped in a mechanical existence that had no connection to authentic life, about yearning for something indefinable that might give meaning to the daily routine of mathematical calculations and military drills. Literature became his secret rebellion. He smuggled novels into his dormitory, reading by candlelight until dawn, allowing fictional characters to populate his imagination in lieu of genuine human connection. But it was during this period of institutional isolation that Dostoevsky first began to understand something crucial about his artistic calling. The very conditions that made him miserable, the loneliness, the psychological pressure, the sense of being trapped in systems beyond his control, were also creating the inner tension necessary for literary creation. Suffering was not simply an obstacle to overcome but raw material to be transformed into art. The transformation was not immediate or conscious. At 17, Dostoevsky still dreamed of escape from his circumstances rather than transcendence through them. He fantasized about running away to Europe, about becoming a revolutionary, about anything that might free him from the grinding routine of military education. What he could not yet see was that these very fantasies of escape were teaching him to inhabit the psychology of characters who would later populate his novels. Underground men trapped in social systems they despised. Dreamers whose imagination had become more real than reality. Rebels whose opposition to authority masked deeper rebellion against existence itself. The ghost of his mother continued to haunt him during these years, but its presence was evolving. No longer simply a source of grief, Maria Fyodorovna's memory became a standard against which he measured all subsequent relationships. Her capacity for love despite suffering, her ability to find beauty in literature despite the ugliness of daily life, her quiet dignity in the face of physical pain, these qualities became the template for the kind of person he wanted to become, the kind of character he would eventually learn to create. When news reached him in June 1839 that his father had died, possibly murdered by his own serfs in a dispute over his increasingly brutal treatment of them, Dostoevsky felt strangely liberated. Dr. Dostoevsky's death removed the last external authority figure whose approval he sought, whose disappointment he feared. Now, he was truly alone in the world, free to discover what kind of person he might become, when not defined by family dynamics or institutional expectations. The official cause of death was listed as stroke, but rumors circulated that the serfs had beaten Dr. Dostoevsky to death during one of his drunken rages. Whether or not patricide had actually occurred, the possibility haunted Fyodor for the rest of his life. The idea that sons might kill fathers, that accumulated resentment might explode into ultimate violence, that family love might transform into family hatred, these themes would obsess him, till he finally wrote them into the Brothers Karamazov for decades later, standing at his father's grave. 19-year-old Dostoevsky experienced a moment of terrible clarity. He understood that he was now responsible for creating his own meaning, his own moral framework, his own relationship with suffering and joy. The authority figures who had shaped his childhood were gone. The institutional structures that had defined his adolescence were temporary. He was radically free and terrifyingly alone. This freedom came with a price he was only beginning to calculate. Without external structures to rebel against, he would have to find internal sources of meaning. Without family approval to seek or disappoint, he would have to develop his own standards of success and failure. Without predetermined roles to accept or reject, he would have to invent his own identity. The young man who walked away from his father's funeral was no longer the frightened child who had watched his mother die. Suffering had begun its work of transformation. Soon, it would teach him that literature was not escape from life's cruelties, but the deepest possible engagement with them. Chapter 2. Literary Awakening. St. Petersburg, 1841. In a cramped room on Vladimirsky Prospect, 20-year-old Fyodor Dostoevsky sat hunched over his desk, surrounded by towers of borrowed books and sheets of paper covered with illegible scrawl. The room smelled of cheap tea, candle wax, and the peculiar mustiness of poverty, combination that would define his living conditions for the next decade. Outside his window, the imperial capital's white nights stretched endlessly, creating a dreamlike atmosphere where time seemed suspended and anything might be possible. He had finally graduated from the Military Engineering Institute, but the prospect of designing fortifications filled him with existential dread. How could someone who had discovered the universe contained within literature waste his life calculating the proper angles for artillery defense? The disconnect between his inner life and expected career path had become unbearable. Every morning brought the same agonizing choice: report to his engineering duties or follow the magnetic pull toward literary creation. The decision, when it came, was both sudden and inevitable. On a gray October morning, Dostoevsky simply failed to appear at his military post. Instead, he walked through St. Petersburg streets until he found himself at the door of a used bookshop, where he traded his military textbooks for copies of Pushkin, Gogol, and Balzac. The symbolic exchange felt like a religious conversion. He was trading the science of destruction for the art of creation, abandoning the external world of engineering for the internal world of human psychology. His first serious literary project emerged from the most unexpected source: a French novel about an elderly postal clerk who lives such a circumscribed existence that his story seems barely worth telling. Honoré de Balzac's Eugenie Grandit contained a minor character, a bureaucrat so insignificant that most readers would forget him immediately. But something about this man's quiet desperation resonated with Dostoevsky's own sense of social invisibility. What if such a person became the center of his own story? What if literature could find dignity and meaning in lives that society dismissed as meaningless? The questions led him to begin writing Poor Folk, a novel told through letters between an aging clerk named Makar Devushkin and a young woman named Varvara, two people whose poverty has rendered them nearly invisible to the world around them. The writing process revealed something extraordinary. Dostoevsky possessed an almost mystical ability to inhabit other consciousnesses. When he wrote in Makar's voice, he became Makar felt the old man's shame at his shabby clothing, his desperate need for respect, his pathetic attempts to maintain dignity in circumstances designed to destroy it. The psychological identification was so complete that finishing each day's writing left him emotionally exhausted, as if he had actually lived through his character's humiliations. Night after night, he worked by candlelight, transforming his own experiences of poverty and social exclusion into literary art. The cramped room became a laboratory for exploring human psychology under extreme pressure. When hunger kept him awake, he wrote about hunger. When loneliness overwhelmed him, he wrote about loneliness. When shame at his circumstances made him want to disappear, he wrote about the psychology of invisibility. His brother Mikhail visited occasionally, bringing food and emotional support, but mostly Dostoevsky worked in complete isolation. This solitude was both torment and necessity. He needed to be alone with his characters, needed to eliminate external distractions that might interfere with the delicate process of psychological discovery. Literature, he was learning, required a kind of willing possession by imaginary beings whose inner lives gradually became more vivid than his own. The breakthrough came in March 1845, when he finally completed Per Folk and gathered the courage to seek publication. Through a literary acquaintance, he managed to get the manuscript to Nikolai Nekrasov, one of St. Petersburg's most influential critics. Dostoevsky spent the night walking the city's streets, too nervous to sleep, alternately convinced that his work was genius and that it was embarrassing garbage. Nekrasov's response exceeded his wildest hopes. The critic not only accepted the novel for publication, but declared it a masterpiece of social realism, comparing it favorably to Gogol's greatest works. More importantly, he arranged for Dostoevsky to meet Vissarion Belinsky, the era's most powerful literary voice, whose approval could make or destroy a young writer's career. The meeting with Belinsky felt like a secular baptism. The great critic read Poor Folk aloud, pausing frequently to comment on particular passages, praising Dostoevsky's ability to reveal the inner nobility of outwardly degraded characters. "You have written a work of true humanitarian significance," Belinsky declared. "You understand that literature's highest calling is to defend the dignity of the human person against all forces that would deny it." For the first time since his mother's death 8 years earlier, Dostoevsky felt truly understood. Here was validation not just of his literary talent, but of his entire worldview, his belief that society's outcasts possessed complex inner lives, that suffering could be transformed into art, that literature might serve as a form of spiritual activism. The approval filled a psychological void that had been growing since childhood, providing the external recognition that his internal struggles had meaning. But success brought unexpected complications. Suddenly, Dostoevsky found himself invited to literary salons, introduced to St. Petersburg's cultural elite as the new voice of Russian humanitarian literature. The attention was intoxicating, but also overwhelming. He had spent years in isolation, developing an artistic vision through solitary struggle, and now he was expected to perform that vision socially, to be the kind of person who could create such empathetic literature. The contradiction proved nearly impossible to navigate. In his writing, Dostoevsky could access infinite reserves of compassion for human weakness. But in person he was awkward, defensive, and prone to argumentative outbursts. His fellow writers expected someone gentle and wise, a literary saint who naturally embodied the humanitarian values of his fiction. Instead, they encountered an intense young man who seemed as psychologically troubled as the characters he created. The disconnect between his literary persona and actual personality led to a series of social disasters. At literary gatherings, he would monopolize conversations, defending his artistic theories with exhausting intensity. He began to suspect that other writers were jealous of his success, that critics were plotting to destroy his reputation, that the literary establishment was fundamentally corrupt. The paranoia that would plague him for the rest of his life first emerged during these months of sudden fame. His second novel, The Double, revealed the psychological pressure he was experiencing. The story of a bureaucrat who encounters his exact duplicate, a man who looks identical but possesses all the social skills and confidence he lacks, was clearly autobiographical allegory. Dostoevsky felt split between his private self, awkward, insecure, desperate for approval, and his public self, the celebrated humanitarian author, and the division was driving him toward breakdown. Critics received The Double with puzzlement and disappointment. Where Poor Folk had been accessible and emotionally direct, The Double was psychologically complex and formally experimental. Readers who expected another straightforward social realist novel instead encountered something closer to psychological horror, a study of mental disintegration that was decades ahead of its time. The poor reception devastated Dostoevsky's confidence. Had his first success been a fluke? Was he actually a one-book author whose talent had been exhausted by a single work? The questions tormented him through sleepless nights, creating a cycle of self-doubt that made writing increasingly difficult. Success, he discovered, could be as psychologically destructive as failure, perhaps more so. because it offered the tantalizing possibility of heights from which one could fall. Yet even in this period of crisis, something essential was crystallizing in his artistic vision. The experience of literary success and subsequent doubt was teaching him that all human achievement was fragile, that identity itself might be fundamentally unstable, that the line between triumph and catastrophe was impossibly thin. These insights would prove crucial for the psychological realism that would define his mature work. Standing at his window during those endless white nights, watching St. Petersburg's ghostly streets reflect moonlight like a city from dreams, Dostoevsky could not have known that he was approaching the most traumatic period of his life. The political activities that had begun as intellectual curiosity were about to become dangerous reality. Soon, suffering would move from his imagination into his actual experience, and the resulting transformation would make him not just a good writer, but a great one. Chapter 3. Illusionary Dreams. Friday evenings in St. Petersburg, 1847. In a modest apartment on Malaya Sadovaya Street, young intellectuals gathered around Mikhail Petrushevsky's tea service to discuss the future of human civilization. The host was a minor government clerk whose passion for French social theory far exceeded his official duties, and his weekly salons attracted the city's most idealistic young men. They came to debate Fourier's utopian socialism, to argue about the possibility of rational social organization, to dream of a Russia transformed by progressive ideas, rather than imperial force. Among the regular attendees, Fyodor Dostoevsky was known for his intensity and his literary reputation. At 26, he had already published Poor Folk to critical acclaim, establishing himself as a voice for society's forgotten victims. But his recent works had been less well received, and he was struggling both financially and creatively. The Petrushevsky Circle offered something his solitary writing life could not: intellectual community, shared purpose, the intoxicating sense of participating in history's forward movement. The discussions ranged widely, from theoretical questions about human perfectibility to practical matters of social reform. Could education eliminate crime? Might rational economic organization end poverty? Was it possible to create institutions that would bring out humanity's cooperative rather than competitive instincts? For young men raised in autocratic Russia, where individual initiative was systematically suppressed, these questions carried revolutionary implications. Dostoevsky found himself particularly drawn to debates about criminal psychology. If crime resulted from social conditions rather than inherent evil, then criminals were victims rather than villains. This perspective aligned perfectly with his literary instincts, his tendency to find humanity in degradation, meaning in apparent meaninglessness. When others saw simple moral categories, he perceived complex psychological realities that resisted easy judgment. But as 1848's revolutionary wave swept across Europe, the group's discussions became more urgently political. News from Paris of barricades and proclamations, reports from Vienna and Berlin of old orders collapsing, stories of peasant uprisings and nationalist movements, all of this created an atmosphere where theoretical socialism began to seem like practical possibility. If change was erupting everywhere else, why not in Russia? The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Meetings that had once focused on abstract philosophy now included discussions of propaganda, organization, action. Some members began talking about the need for underground networks, secret printing presses, coordinated resistance to Tsarist authority. The Salon was becoming a conspiracy, and its members were crossing the line from intellectual speculation to revolutionary commitment. Dostoevsky's involvement deepened partly from idealistic conviction and partly from psychological need. His literary career was stagnating. Recent stories had received lukewarm reviews, and money was constantly scarce. The revolutionary activities offered purpose beyond personal success, meaning that transcended individual achievement. If he could not change the world through literature alone, perhaps he could do so through political action combined with literary expression. The specific catalyst was Nikolai Speshnov, a magnetic young aristocrat whose revolutionary commitment was absolute. Speshnov had traveled in Europe, witnessed revolutionary activities firsthand, and possessed the kind of charismatic authority that Dostoevsky both envied and needed. When Speshnov argued that Russian writers had a duty to move beyond mere criticism to active resistance, Dostoevsky found the argument irresistible. Under Speshnov's influence, Dostoevsky began participating in the Circle's most dangerous activities. He helped distribute forbidden literature, including works by Alexander Herzen that called for peasant revolution and the complete transformation of Russian society. More dangerously, he agreed to read aloud Vissarion Belinsky's inflammatory letter to Gogol, a document that attacked the Russian Orthodox Church and Tsarist autocracy with unprecedented directness. The letter reading took place on April 15, 1849, in front of a small group that included several government informants. As Dostoevsky recited Belinsky's passionate denunciation of religious obscurantism and political oppression, he felt himself crossing a point of no return. These were not merely words but declarations of war against the entire system that had shaped his life. The psychological charge was intoxicating. Finally, he was acting on convictions rather than simply writing about them. Yet even in his moment of greatest revolutionary commitment, Dostoevsky retained something that set him apart from his co-conspirators, an almost mystical empathy that prevented him from demonizing his enemies. While others spoke of overthrowing the Tsar with bloodthirsty enthusiasm, he found himself imagining the psychological complexity of autocrats, the human motivations that might drive someone to embrace absolute power. This imaginative sympathy would later make him one of literature's greatest portraitists of evil, but it also made him an imperfect revolutionary. The arrests began before dawn on April 23, 1849. Secret police surrounded the homes of known Petrushevsky Circle members, seizing books, papers, and people with methodical efficiency. When they came for Dostoevsky, he was sleeping off another night of anxious insomnia, dreaming of literary success that seemed increasingly elusive. The knock on his door awakened him to a reality more dramatic than any fiction he had imagined. The Peter and Paul Fortress, where political prisoners awaited trial, was a place designed to break human spirit through isolation and uncertainty. Dostoevsky spent 8 months in a cell barely large enough for a cot and writing desk, with no knowledge of when or whether he would be released. The sensory deprivation was absolute. No books, no writing materials, no human contact, except with guards who were forbidden to speak. For someone whose entire identity revolved around literature and ideas, the punishment was precisely calculated psychological torture. Yet this enforced solitude also produced unexpected insights. Without external distractions, Dostoevsky was forced to confront aspects of his own psychology that literary creation had previously helped him avoid. The revolutionary idealism that had seemed so noble in Petrushevsky's salon revealed itself as partly motivated by personal resentment, wounded pride, the desire to matter in a world that seemed determined to render him insignificant. More importantly, he began to understand something crucial about the relationship between suffering and spiritual development. The physical discomfort of imprisonment was less significant than the psychological challenge of maintaining human dignity under conditions designed to destroy it. How did one preserve inner freedom when external freedom had been eliminated? How did one resist despair when hope itself seemed irrational? These questions would become central to his mature literary work. But in the fortress cell, they were matters of immediate survival. He developed what he would later call underground psychology, the ability to maintain interior life independent of external circumstances, to find meaning in suffering itself, to transform victimization into a form of spiritual victory. The trial, when it finally came, was less judicial proceeding than imperial theater. The charges included conspiracy against state security, possession of seditious literature, and participation in criminal association. The evidence was overwhelming. Government informants had documented every meeting, recorded every dangerous conversation. Dostoevsky's guilt was indisputable, and everyone involved knew that the sentence would be death. Standing in the courtroom, listening to charges that could result in execution, Dostoevsky experienced a strange psychological detachment. The proceedings seemed to involve someone else, a fictional character whose fate was being determined by plot requirements rather than personal choice. This dissociation was partly defensive mechanism and partly artistic insight. He was simultaneously experiencing dramatic crisis and observing his own experience with the coolness of a novelist studying character under pressure. When the death sentence was announced, his primary emotion was not fear but curiosity. How would he respond to approaching execution? What psychological changes would occur as the date approached? Would courage or cowardice prove stronger? The questions felt both urgent and academic. He was about to discover experimentally what he had previously only imagined through literary creation. But the most significant revelation came through recognizing how completely his revolutionary activities had been driven by literary impulses rather than genuine political conviction. He had been attracted to rebellion not because he truly believed in socialist theory, but because he found the psychology of revolutionaries artistically fascinating. The Circle had been less political organization than research laboratory, a place to study human behavior under conditions of idealistic pressure. This recognition would prove crucial for his artistic development. Politics, he understood, was ultimately a subset of psychology. Social movements succeeded or failed based on their ability to address deeper human needs for meaning, purpose, community. Revolutionary activities had taught him that changing society required understanding individual psychology in all its contradiction and complexity. As he was led back to his cell to await execution, Dostoevsky carried with him knowledge that would transform his artistic vision. He had learned that suffering could be a source of insight rather than simply an obstacle to overcome. Soon, that knowledge would be tested in ways that would either destroy him or create the psychological depth necessary for literary greatness. Chapter 4. Mock execution. The night before December 22, 1849, Fyodor Dostoevsky lay on his narrow prison cot, calculating time in heartbeats. 8 months in the Peter and Paul fortress had taught him to measure existence in the smallest possible units, the rhythm of blood through arteries, the interval between breaths, the precise duration of each thought before it dissolved into the next. Tomorrow, at dawn, all these measurements would cease. The mathematics of mortality were simple. 28 years of accumulated consciousness would be subtracted from the universe by rifle fire. He had spent the previous week in a state of heightened awareness that was both torment and revelation. Color seemed more vivid, sounds more distinct, textures more immediate. The rough wool of his prison uniform felt rich as velvet. The thin soup they served carried complex flavors he had never noticed. The guards' footsteps in the corridor created rhythmic patterns of almost musical complexity. It was as if approaching death had stripped away the protective numbness that made ordinary life bearable, exposing the overwhelming richness of sensory experience that consciousness normally filtered and diminished. The condemned men had been allowed to write final letters, and Dostoevsky's to his brother Mikhail revealed a mind struggling to compress a lifetime's understanding into final words. Life is everywhere. Life is in ourselves, and not in the external. There will be people near me, and to be a human being among human beings, and remain one forever. No matter what misfortunes befall, to become depressed, and not to falter. This is what life is about. This is its task. But beneath the noble sentiment lay something darker, the recognition that he was about to experience the most dramatic possible moment of human existence. And part of him was curious about his own psychological response. Would courage or terror prove stronger? Would consciousness remain clear until the final second? Or would fear produce protective dissociation? He was simultaneously victim and observer, the condemned man and the novelist studying the condemned man's psychology. The other prisoners, Petrushevsky, Speshnov, Grigoriev, handled the waiting differently. Some wrote obsessively, trying to capture every significant memory before memory itself was extinguished. Others sat in apparent meditation, seeking spiritual preparation for whatever came after death. A few paced their cells like caged animals, too agitated for stillness, too frightened for acceptance. Dostoevsky found himself envying their clarity of response. His own emotions were too contradictory, too complicated for such straightforward expression. When the guards came at 5 in the morning, the sound of keys and locks seemed impossibly loud in the fortress silence. The 21 condemned men were chained together and loaded into transport wagons for the journey to Semyonovsky Square, where scaffolds had been erected for their execution. Through the small barred windows, St. Petersburg's morning streets appeared transformed, almost ethereal in the early light. Everything looked precious because it was being seen for the last time. Dostoevsky found himself thinking about literary technique, how inadequately language captured the experience of approaching death, how conventional narrative structures failed to convey the psychological complexity of extreme moments. If he survived this experience, he thought with bitter irony, he would need to develop entirely new ways of representing consciousness under ultimate pressure. The thought provided a moment's escape from immediate terror. Even facing execution, his mind automatically processed experience as potential artistic material. The square was filled with soldiers, spectators, officials. A priest moved among the condemned men, offering final communion and spiritual consolation. When he reached Dostoevsky, the priest whispered words about divine mercy and eternal salvation, but the sounds seemed to come from an impossible distance. All of Dostoevsky's attention was focused on sensory details, the texture of snow beneath his feet, the sound of drums in the distance, the weight of chains around his wrists. They were positioned in groups of 3 before the firing squads. Dostoevsky was in the third group, which meant he would watch his fellow conspirators die before facing the rifles himself. The psychological torture of this arrangement was precisely calculated. Imperial justice wanted them to experience not just death, but the anticipation of death. Not just punishment, but the psychological destruction that came from waiting to be punished. The first 3 men were blindfolded and positioned against posts. Among them was Nikolai Grigoriev, who had recruited Dostoevsky into the Petrushevsky circle's most dangerous activities. As the soldiers raised their rifles, Grigoriev's face showed an expression of puzzled concentration, as if he were trying to solve a mathematical problem. Dostoevsky realized that he was memorizing that expression, storing it for future use in some story that would never be written. The rifles were aimed. The officer raised his sword for the signal to fire, but instead of gunshots, drums began to roll, not the short roll that preceded execution, but the longer rhythm that announced imperial announcements. A courier galloped into the square, waving documents. The executions were suspended while officials read and conferred. The first 3 men remained blindfolded at the posts, not knowing whether they were dead or alive, while bureaucracy slowly determined their fate. The wait lasted 20 minutes, during which Dostoevsky experienced every possible emotion with hallucinatory intensity. Relief that his own execution was delayed, warred with terror for his friends who remained positioned before the rifles. Gratitude for unexpected time competed with agonizing uncertainty about what the delay meant. Hope fought with the certainty that hope itself might be a cruelty designed to make the eventual execution more painful. When the courier finally announced that Emperor Nicholas I had commuted their sentences to Siberian exile, the psychological impact was almost too complex for consciousness to process. They were simultaneously saved and destroyed, rescued from death, but condemned to years of imprisonment and labor that might prove worse than quick execution. The gift of continued life came with the guarantee of continued suffering. Dostoevsky's legs buckled as the chains were removed, not from physical weakness, but from the impossibility of adjusting instantly from death preparation to life continuation. Around him, other men wept, laughed, or stood in stunned silence. Some kissed the ground. Others embraced the soldiers who had been prepared to shoot them. The emotional chaos was unprecedented. Joy and terror, gratitude and despair, relief and new fear all existed simultaneously. But the most profound change was perceptual. The world appeared completely transformed, charged with significance that had been invisible before the execution experience. Every object seemed to glow with inner light. Every sound carried meaning beyond its literal content. Every moment felt saturated with possibility. It was as if death proximity had awakened some dormant sense organ that revealed reality's hidden dimensions. This heightened awareness came with the terrible burden, the knowledge that ordinary consciousness was a form of blindness, that most people lived their entire lives without perceiving the richness and complexity that were always present, but usually hidden. He had been given a gift of vision, but it was vision of how much was normally unseen, how much life was typically unlived. The journey back to the fortress for final processing passed in a dream, a state where time seemed elastic and cause and effect relationships felt arbitrary. Dostoevsky understood that he was no longer the same person who had awakened that morning. The mock execution had killed something in him even as it preserved his physical life. What emerged was someone with direct experience of ultimate extremity, someone who had touched the absolute boundary of human experience and returned with knowledge that could not be communicated to those who had not shared it. In his cell that night, writing in a journal they had permitted him to keep during his final days in St. Petersburg, Dostoevsky tried to capture what had happened. The scaffold had been erected, and I believed that in a few minutes I would die. I thought of my mother, of my family. I wanted to embrace them all. Then suddenly came the reprieve. I felt as if I had been born again. But the rebirth was not triumph, it was the beginning of a more complex form of suffering. He had learned that life was simultaneously more precious and more fragile than he had previously understood, that death was both more terrible and more arbitrary than imagination could conceive, that consciousness itself was a miracle too vast for normal awareness to grasp. These insights would haunt him for the rest of his life, driving him to create characters who shared his experience of extremity, his knowledge of the thin line between existence and annihilation. Soon, Siberian exile would test whether such knowledge was a blessing or a curse, whether surviving ultimate crisis prepared someone for ordinary life, or made ordinary life impossible to bear. Chapter 5: Siberian Exile. Christmas Day, 1849. The prison train lurched eastward through Russian winter, carrying 21 political prisoners toward Siberian exile. Each jolt of the wheels over frozen tracks felt like a heartbeat counting down to an unknown, but certainly terrible destination. For Fyodor Dostoevsky, shackled in a compartment barely large enough for standing, the journey represented a descent into a Russia he had only imagined, the vast, empty spaces where the empire disposed of its unwanted citizens, where civilization thinned to almost nothing, where human endurance faced its ultimate test. The landscape outside the barred windows seemed designed to crush human hope. Endless forests broken by frozen rivers, occasional villages that looked abandoned even when smoke rose from chimneys, distances so vast they challenged the mind's ability to process scale. This was not the European Russia of St. Petersburg's literary salons and philosophical discussions, but the Asian Russia where survival itself required capabilities that urban intellectuals had never needed to develop. His fellow prisoners represented the empire's educational elite, university professors, minor nobles, government clerks whose crime had been reading forbidden books and discussing dangerous ideas. None were prepared for what awaited them. Their revolutionary idealism had been shaped by French social theory and German philosophy, not by practical experience of physical hardship. The irony was bitter. Men who had dreamed of liberating Russia's oppressed masses were about to discover firsthand what oppression actually meant. The Omsk prison fortress, when they finally reached it after weeks of travel, appeared like something from medieval nightmares. Massive log walls surrounded a compound designed to contain the empire's most dangerous criminals, murderers, bandits, army deserters whose violence had made them unsuitable even for military discipline. The political prisoners would share the space with men whose relationship to civilization was fundamentally different from their own. Dostoevsky's first glimpse of his future cellmates shattered every romantic notion he had harbored about society's outcasts. These were not the noble criminals of literature, not the misunderstood victims of social injustice he had written about in Poor Folk. They were men whose capacity for cruelty seemed unlimited, whose moral categories bore no relationship to any philosophical system he could recognize. Their faces showed the accumulated damage of lives lived without constraint, without hope, without the civilizing influence of education or religious training. The daily routine was calculated to break human dignity through systematic degradation. Prisoners woke at dawn to the sound of chains and bells, ate thin gruel from wooden bowls while standing in formation, then marched to work sites where they performed manual labor under armed guard. For Dostoevsky, whose hands had never known physical work, the experience was immediately catastrophic. After a few days of attempting to keep pace with men accustomed to hard labor, his palms were raw with blisters, his back ached constantly, and his entire body felt like it was disintegrating. But the physical suffering was less significant than the psychological challenge of maintaining identity among men who seemed to represent humanity's most primitive impulses. Many of the criminals viewed the political prisoners with contempt, educated weaklings whose abstract idealism struck them as laughably irrelevant to the realities of survival. They sensed immediately that Dostoevsky and his comrades possessed something that could be stripped away, the belief that civilization mattered, that ideas had value, that human dignity was worth preserving. The test came during his first winter in Omsk, when a group of hardened criminals decided to break the political prisoners completely. They stole food, destroyed personal belongings, created situations where the educated men would be forced to choose between physical resistance and complete capitulation. For Dostoevsky, the moment of crisis came when a murderer named Gazin deliberately destroyed a book that had somehow survived the journey from St. Petersburg, a volume of poetry that represented his last connection to the literary world he had lost. His response surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of rage or despair, he felt a kind of mystical compassion for Gazin, recognizing in the criminal's cruelty a form of suffering more profound than his own. This was a man so damaged by life that destroying beauty had become a necessity for psychological survival. Understanding this did not excuse the cruelty, but it revealed something essential about human nature, that evil often emerged from wounds too deep for healing, that monsters were created by monstrous circumstances. This insight became the foundation for a transformed literary vision. The criminals around him were not fundamentally different from the educated men they tormented. They were the same human nature exposed to conditions that had stripped away protective illusions about civilization's power to constrain natural impulses. Everyone contained the capacity for both cruelty and compassion. Circumstances determined which impulse became dominant. The revelation was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. If criminals and intellectuals shared the same basic psychology, then his own capacity for evil was far greater than he had previously imagined. The revolutionary activities that had brought him to Siberia suddenly appeared in a different light, not as noble idealism, but as potential violence disguised by philosophical justification. The line between political reform and criminal destruction was thinner than he had realized. This understanding deepened during a friendship he developed with a fellow prisoner named Sushalov, a man convicted of murdering his wife and children during a drunken rage. According to his own confession, Sushalov had been a loving father and devoted husband until alcohol destroyed his self-control. One night of drinking had transformed him from protector to destroyer of everything he held sacred. Yet in prison, he displayed gentleness, intelligence, and genuine remorse that suggested his crime represented a temporary possession by forces beyond conscious control. Conversations with Sushalov revealed the inadequacy of simple moral categories. Here was a man who had committed ultimate evil, yet retained enough humanity to suffer authentically for his actions. Was he a good man who had done something terrible, or a terrible man capable of goodness? The question had no satisfactory answer, but exploring it taught Dostoevsky something crucial about the psychological complexity he would need to capture in his mature literary work. The prison's chapel services provided another form of education in human contradiction. Every Sunday, murderers and thieves gathered to hear readings from scripture, to sing hymns, to participate in rituals that assumed human capacity for redemption. Some clearly attended only because chapel offered relief from labor, but others showed genuine spiritual hunger that coexisted mysteriously with their criminal histories. The sight of men who had committed unspeakable violence weeping during prayers forced Dostoevsky to confront questions about sin, forgiveness, and transformation that his previous literary work had only approached theoretically. His own relationship with faith underwent fundamental change during these years. The abstract religious sentiment of his childhood gave way to something more complex: recognition that spiritual life required constant struggle against internal forces of destruction, that redemption was not theoretical possibility, but psychological necessity for anyone who hoped to remain human under dehumanizing conditions. Faith became less about theological doctrine than about the practical challenge of preserving hope when hope seemed rationally unjustified. The physical conditions of prison life, inadequate food and sanitary facilities, brutal work assignments, were designed to reduce human beings to purely animal existence. But Dostoevsky discovered that accepting this reduction was a choice rather than an inevitability. Even under the worst conditions, it remained possible to maintain inner freedom through acts of imagination, memory, and will. The body could be imprisoned, but consciousness could preserve spaces that no external authority could penetrate. This distinction between outer and inner life became central to his developing artistic philosophy. Literature's highest purpose was not to describe external circumstances, but to explore the psychological strategies through which human beings maintain dignity under conditions designed to destroy it. The most important battles were fought not in the social or political realm, but in the interior space where individual consciousness confronted forces that sought to reduce it to something less than human. As his 4-year sentence progressed, Dostoevsky began to understand that his Siberian experience was not simply punishment but education in depths of human nature that could not be learned any other way. The suffering was real and terrible, but it was also teaching him to write about psychological extremity with authority that no purely imaginative effort could have provided. By his final winter in Omsk, he had developed the psychological insights that would inform all his great novels: that human beings contain capacities for both transcendence and degradation far beyond what civilized society acknowledged, that suffering could be either destructive or transformative depending on how consciousness responded to it, and that redemption was possible even for those who had committed the most terrible acts, not because evil didn't matter, but because human nature was complex enough to contain contradictory impulses simultaneously. The man who would eventually leave Siberian exile was no longer the naive revolutionary who had entered it, nor was he the promising young author who had written Poor Folk from comfortable St. Petersburg apartments. 4 years of intimate contact with extreme human experience had created something unprecedented: a writer with both the literary sophistication to create complex psychological portraits and the personal knowledge of extremity necessary to make those portraits authentic. Chapter 6: Underground Psychology. St. Petersburg, 1859. After a decade of exile and military service, Fyodor Dostoevsky returned to the imperial capital as a different species of human being. The city's elegant facades and intellectual cafes seemed like stage sets from some half-remembered dream, beautiful but insubstantial, lacking the terrible authenticity he had discovered in Siberian prison barracks. Walking the same streets where he had once debated revolutionary politics with youthful idealism, he felt like a ghost returning to haunt his former life. The literary world that had briefly celebrated him as a rising humanitarian voice had moved on. New names dominated the journals and salons, new theories commanded attention, new social movements claimed to represent progress and enlightenment. Dostoevsky found himself cast as a relic from an earlier era, a writer whose brief moment of relevance had passed while he was occupied with the tedious business of surviving imprisonment and forced military service. But the apparent irrelevance was deceptive. While his contemporaries had continued developing variations on familiar themes, social realism, progressive politics, rational reformism, Dostoevsky had undergone experiences that had revealed the inadequacy of all conventional approaches to understanding human nature. He possessed knowledge that no amount of theoretical study could provide, direct experience of psychological extremity, intimate acquaintance with the forces of destruction and creation that operated beneath civilization's surface. The challenge was translating this knowledge into literary form that readers could comprehend without having shared his experiences. How could someone who had never faced execution understand the psychology of approaching death? How could people who had never lived among criminals appreciate the moral complexity of those who had committed terrible acts? How could comfortable bourgeois readers grasp the insights that emerged only under conditions of absolute extremity? The solution emerged gradually through a series of experimental works that pushed the boundaries of conventional narrative. Instead of writing about characters who resembled his readers, Dostoevsky began creating protagonists who embodied psychological states that most people preferred not to acknowledge in themselves. His post-exile fiction explored the underground regions of consciousness where civilized pretenses collapsed and human nature revealed its true complexity. Notes from Underground, begun in 1863, presented the culmination of this experimental approach. The novella's narrator was unlike any character in previous Russian literature, educated but self-loathing, intelligent but paralyzed by consciousness, capable of profound insight, but unable to act constructively on his understanding. He was neither hero nor villain, but something more disturbing, a recognizably human figure whose psychological honesty made conventional moral categories seem inadequate. The underground man's famous declaration, "I am a sick man, I am a spiteful man," announced a new type of literary consciousness. This was not the noble suffering of romantic literature or the dignified endurance of social realist fiction, but something harder to categorize: authentic psychological pain that resisted easy sympathy or simple solutions. The narrator's self-awareness made him neither admirable nor pitiable, but simply human in ways that most literature had been afraid to explore. Writing the underground man's monologue required Dostoevsky to access psychological regions he had discovered during his darkest moments in Siberian exile. The narrator's compulsive self-analysis, his inability to sustain relationships, his oscillation between grandiose fantasies and crushing self-contempt, all of this emerged from Dostoevsky's own experience of isolation, failure, and the peculiar form of suffering that comes from understanding one's own psychological mechanisms too clearly. But the underground man was not simply autobiographical confession. He was a representative figure, embodying psychological tendencies that modern urban civilization seemed to produce with increasing frequency. The story suggested that rational social progress might actually be creating new forms of human misery, that education, urbanization, and material comfort might generate psychological problems more complex than the physical hardships they were designed to solve. The novella's reception revealed how completely Dostoevsky's artistic vision had diverged from contemporary literary expectations. Progressive critics dismissed it as pathological self-indulgence, conservative reviewers found it morally offensive, and general readers were simply puzzled by a story that seemed to offer no clear message about social improvement or individual redemption. The psychological realism that would eventually establish Dostoevsky's reputation was initially perceived as artistic failure. Yet the underground men represented a breakthrough in literary technique that would influence fiction for generations. By creating a narrator who was simultaneously observer and observed, analyst and subject of analysis, Dostoevsky had discovered a way to represent consciousness from the inside without sacrificing external perspective. The character was both participant in his own psychological drama and commentator on that drama, creating a level of self-awareness that made traditional narrative omniscience seem crude by comparison. This technique emerged directly from his prison experience, where survival had required developing sophisticated strategies for psychological self-observation. In Siberian exile, the ability to monitor one's own mental states, to recognize emerging patterns of despair or hope, to maintain analytical distance from immediate emotional experience, these capabilities had been matters of practical necessity. Now, they became artistic tools for creating unprecedented forms of literary realism. The underground man's most distinctive characteristic was his compulsive honesty about psychological processes that conventional society preferred to ignore. He admitted to enjoying his own suffering, to taking pleasure in humiliation, to preferring the intensity of misery to the numbness of contentment. These confessions violated fundamental assumptions about human motivation that underwrote both literature and social theory, suggesting that people might be far more psychologically complex and contradictory than rational analysis could accommodate. Dostoevsky's own circumstances during this period reflected some of the underground man's contradictions. Despite his growing literary reputation, he remained financially desperate, psychologically isolated, and increasingly addicted to gambling. His personal life was a series of failed relationships and self-destructive decisions that seemed to confirm his character's insights about the irrationality of human behavior. Success in understanding psychology had not translated into success in managing his own psychological difficulties. The gambling addiction, which had begun during his years of military service in Siberia, had become a compulsion that dominated his emotional life. The experience of losing money the family desperately needed, of making promises to his wife that he knew he would break, of feeling simultaneously guilty and excited by his own self-destructive behavior, all of this provided material for understanding characters who were similarly trapped between knowledge and action, insight and compulsion. His notebooks from this period reveal a writer struggling to comprehend his own motivations while using that struggle as raw material for artistic creation. "Why do I continue gambling when I know it destroys everything I care about?" he wrote. "Because the excitement of potential loss is more real than the satisfaction of security. Because crisis is more interesting than contentment. Because I need to feel that my choices matter, even when they are terrible choices." These insights into his own psychological complexity informed his developing understanding of how modern consciousness operated. The underground man's paralysis resulted not from lack of will but from excess of analysis. He understood too much about his own motivations to act with the simplicity that effective action required. Knowledge had become a form of imprisonment rather than liberation. This paradox would become central to Dostoevsky's mature fiction. His greatest characters, Raskolnikov, Ivan Karamazov, Stavrodin would all be figures whose intellectual sophistication created rather than solved their essential problems. They represented a new type of literary protagonist, the person whose capacity for psychological analysis exceeded their capacity for psychological health. The underground man's legacy extended beyond literature into psychology and philosophy. His insights about consciousness, motivation, and the relationship between reason and emotion would influence thinkers from Nietzsche to Freud to existentialist philosophers. But in 1863, the character seemed merely puzzling to strange for popular success, too psychologically accurate for comfortable dismissal. Working late into St. Petersburg's White Nights, surrounded by notebooks filled with observations about human behavior under pressure, Dostoevsky was developing the artistic tools he would need for his greatest works. The Underground Man had been an experiment in psychological realism. The next novels would test whether such realism could sustain the architectural complexity of great fiction. He was no longer the promising young humanitarian author who had written Poor Folk with straightforward sympathy for society's victims. Nor was he the naive revolutionary who had believed social problems could be solved through rational reform. He had become something unprecedented, a psychological archaeologist capable of excavating the deepest layers of human motivation and revealing them in literary form that made the familiar seem strange and the strange seem inevitable. Chapter 7: Crime and Psychology. Summer 1865, St. Petersburg. In a suffocating garret room barely 6 paces long, Fyodor Dostoevsky sits surrounded by newspapers reporting yet another brutal murder that has transfixed the city. A young pawnbroker has been killed with an axe. apparently by someone she knew and trusted. Someone who walked away with a handful of rubles and a lifetime burden of guilt. The case dominates CAF conversations and editorial column, but Dostoevsky reads between the lines with the penetrating insight of someone who has lived among murderers and learned to see crime as a window into the deepest recesses of human psychology. The external circumstances of his own life mirrored his fictional character's desperation. He was behind on rent, surviving on borrowed money, trapped in literary contracts that demanded productivity while his gambling addiction destroyed his ability to work systematically. His notebooks from this period reveal a mind simultaneously consumed by financial panic and electrified by artistic possibility. I have an idea for a psychological study: a young man who commits murder not from passion or necessity, but from ideology. What would such a psychology look like? This question had been gestating since his Siberian years, when conversations with fellow prisoners had revealed the inadequacy of simple explanations for criminal behavior. Some murderers acted from rage, others from desperation, still others from what seemed like pure malevolence. But occasionally, he had encountered men whose crimes seemed to emerge from some twisted form of philosophical conviction, as if they had reasoned themselves into evil rather than fallen into it through weakness or circumstance. The character who would become Raskolnikov began as an investigation into this psychological territory. What if someone committed murder not because they were naturally criminal, but because they had convinced themselves that conventional moral law should not apply to exceptional individuals? What if the crime emerged not from the absence of conscience, but from its perverse sophistication? What if guilt and justification could coexist in the same consciousness, creating a psychological battlefield where neither could achieve permanent victory? Working through the sweltering Petersburg summer of 1865, Dostoevsky began mapping the psychological architecture that would support crime and punishment. The novel would need to sustain nearly 600 pages of intense psychological analysis, following a character's consciousness through crime, guilt, investigation, and potential redemption. No Russian novel had previously attempted such sustained focus on interior experience, such detailed exploration of the relationship between thought and action. The technical challenge was enormous. How could a narrative maintain reader engagement while spending most of its time inside the mind of a character whose thoughts were often unpleasant, whose moral reasoning was fundamentally flawed, whose psychological condition grew increasingly unstable as the story progressed? Traditional plot mechanisms, romantic intrigue, social conflict, dramatic revelations would be subordinated to psychological development. The story's suspense would emerge not from external events, but from the question of whether consciousness could survive the pressure of its own knowledge. Dostoevsky's solution was to create a psychological thriller in which the detective story framework served primarily to externalize the protagonist's internal conflicts. Porfiry Petrovich, the investigating magistrate, would function less as conventional antagonist than as externalized conscience, using legal interrogation to force Raskolnikov through the same psychological analysis that guilt was already conducting internally. The cat-and-mouse game between criminal and detective would mirror the battle between different aspects of the same consciousness. But the novel's psychological realism required more than clever plot construction. Dostoevsky needed to understand criminal psychology with scientific accuracy, not merely dramatic effectiveness. His notebooks reveal extensive research into contemporary theories of crime, mental illness, and moral reasoning. He studied medical texts about psychological disorders, legal documents about criminal trials, newspaper reports about similar murders. The fiction would be grounded in empirical observation rather than pure imagination. More importantly, he drew upon his own experience of moral extremity during the mock execution and Siberian imprisonment. The psychological pressure that had nearly destroyed his sanity during those years provided a template for understanding how consciousness responded to circumstances that exceeded normal human capacity for processing. Raskolnikov's mental state after the murder would reflect the same psychological patterns Dostoevsky had observed in himself and others when external pressure made ordinary psychological functioning impossible. The writing process itself became a form of psychological experimentation. To create Raskolnikov's voice authentically, Dostoevsky had to access aspects of his own psychology that resembled his character's moral confusion and emotional extremity. He wrote in a state of controlled psychological possession, allowing Raskolnikov's consciousness to dominate his own awareness for hours at a time, then struggling to emerge from that identification without losing the insights it had provided. His wife Anna later described finding him after particularly intense writing sessions, sitting motionless at his desk, apparently unaware of his surroundings, his face reflecting emotions that seemed to belong to someone else. The creative process required him to experience his character's psychological states directly rather than simply imagining them, and the boundary between author and character sometimes became alarmingly permeable. This technique produced unprecedented psychological authenticity, but at considerable personal cost. Dostoevsky's own mental health suffered during the composition of Crime and Punishment, as the daily practice of inhabiting a murderer's consciousness triggered his own latent tendencies toward guilt, paranoia, and self-punishment. The gambling addiction worsened during this period, as if he needed some external form of self-destructive behavior to balance the psychological intensity of literary creation. The novel's exploration of guilt revealed insights that modern psychology would later systematize, but that Dostoevsky discovered through artistic intuition. Raskolnikov's inability to benefit from his crime, his compulsive return to the murder scene, his simultaneous desire for confession and punishment, all of this reflected psychological patterns that Dostoevsky had observed in Siberian prisoners whose crimes had created internal conflicts between different moral systems. But Crime and Punishment was not simply a case study in criminal psychology. It was an investigation into the moral philosophy that underlay Russian society during a period of rapid social change. Raskolnikov's theory that exceptional individuals should be exempt from conventional moral law reflected ideas that were circulating among radical intellectuals, particularly the notion that historical progress required the sacrifice of traditional ethical constraints. The novel asked whether rational analysis could provide adequate foundation for moral behavior, or whether such analysis inevitably led to the kind of logical extremism that justified murder. This question had personal urgency for Dostoevsky, whose own revolutionary activities had been motivated by similar confidence in rational social theory. His experience of how intellectual conviction could lead to dangerous action, and how suffering could reveal the inadequacy of purely theoretical approaches to human problems informed the novel's skepticism about ideology untempered by lived experience of human complexity. The character of Sonia, the prostitute whose faith provides a counterpoint to Raskolnikov's rationalism, represented Dostoevsky's developing understanding of alternative approaches to moral questions. Her response to degrading circumstances was not philosophical analysis, but practical compassion. Not theoretical speculation about justice, but direct engagement with suffering wherever she encountered it. Through her, the novel suggested that authentic moral insight might require accepting mystery rather than demanding logical clarity. As Crime and Punishment neared completion in late 1866, Dostoevsky understood that he had created something unprecedented in Russian literature, a novel that used crime story conventions to explore psychological territory that had never been systematically mapped in fiction. The book would establish psychological realism as a legitimate alternative to the social realism that dominated contemporary Russian literature, proving that internal experience could provide material for serious artistic investigation. But the novel's deeper achievement was demonstrating how individual psychology connected to larger social and philosophical questions. Raskolnikov's crime emerged from his particular psychological makeup, but that makeup had been shaped by social conditions, intellectual currents, and historical circumstances that extended far beyond personal pathology. The novel suggested that understanding individual behavior required understanding the complex web of forces social, psychological, philosophical, spiritual, that shaped human consciousness in particular historical moments. This insight would become central to Dostoevsky's subsequent masterpieces. Each of his great novels would focus intensively on individual psychological experience, while revealing how that experience reflected broader patterns of social and spiritual crisis. He had learned to use the microscope of psychological analysis to reveal the macroscopic forces that were reshaping human consciousness during the modern era. Chapter 8. The Idiot. Autumn 1867, Dresden. Fyodor Dostoevsky sits in a modest pension room, holding his newborn daughter, Sophia, while his wife Anna sleeps fitfully in the narrow bed beside him. The infant's breathing provides the only sound in the pre-dawn darkness, tiny, regular inhalations that seem impossibly fragile against the weight of existence. Outside, early morning coaches rattle over cobblestones as Dresden awakens to another day of Germanic efficiency. But inside this cramped space, time moves differently, marked by the rhythm of new life and the slow accumulation of literary inspiration. Sophia lived only 3 months, dying of pneumonia during Dresden's bitter winter. Her death created a psychic wound that would never fully heal, but it also awakened in Dostoevsky an understanding of innocence that had been largely theoretical until he watched it emerge from and return to mystery in the space of a few precious weeks. What did it mean to be purely good in a world that seemed designed to corrupt or destroy goodness? What would such a person look like? How would they survive? What effect would they have on others who had accommodated themselves to moral compromise? These questions led to his most ambitious artistic experiment, creating a protagonist who would embody the Christian ideal of perfect love, while remaining psychologically believable as a human being. Prince Mishkin, the protagonist of The Idiot, would be a kind of secular Christ figure, someone whose fundamental innocence and compassion would serve as a standard against which all other characters' moral compromises could be measured. But Dostoevsky's genius lay in recognizing that perfect goodness, rather than solving human problems, might actually intensify them. A truly innocent person entering sophisticated social circles would function like a moral catalyst, forcing others to confront the gap between their professed values and actual behavior. Mishkin's presence would not heal the corrupt aristocratic world he encountered, but would expose its corruptions more clearly, creating dramatic situations that revealed character through moral choice, rather than external conflict. The technical challenge was extraordinary. How could a novelist sustain reader interest in a character who lacked the psychological complexity that usually drove narrative forward? How could perfect virtue avoid becoming dramatically inert? How could someone too good for the world he inhabited avoid seeming either inhuman or insufferable? Dostoevsky's solution was to give Mishkin epilepsy, a condition that provided both explanation for his otherworldly perspective and dramatic vulnerability that made his goodness touching rather than intimidating. The epilepsy was not arbitrary plot device, but psychologically calculated element. Dostoevsky himself suffered from epileptic seizures, and he understood from personal experience how the condition created altered states of consciousness that seemed to offer glimpses of spiritual reality, usually hidden from normal awareness. Mishkin's epileptic visions would provide him with direct experience of transcendent beauty and meaning, making his faith less a matter of belief than of empirical knowledge. This autobiographical element reflected Dostoevsky's own complex relationship with his medical condition. Epileptic seizures were socially stigmatizing and psychologically terrifying, but they also produced moments of insight and aesthetic experience that felt more real than ordinary consciousness. In his notebooks, he described the pre-seizure aura as a state of heightened awareness where everything is light, everything is harmonious, everything is flooded with love. Even though this experience was inevitably followed by confusion, disorientation, and physical collapse. Mishkin's epilepsy would serve similar narrative function, providing access to spiritual insights that made him compassionate and wise, but also marking him as psychologically fragile in ways that made his survival in a competitive social environment unlikely. His medical condition became a metaphor for the relationship between spiritual sensitivity and worldly effectiveness, suggesting that the qualities that made someone morally exceptional might also make them practically vulnerable. The novel's aristocratic setting allowed Dostoevsky to explore themes of inherited corruption and moral decay that obsessed him during his European exile. Russian high society in St. Petersburg seemed to him like a hothouse environment where natural human impulses had been refined into elaborate forms of cruelty and self-deception. Characters like Nastasia Filipovna and Rogozin represented different responses to this corruption, self-destructive rebellion and primitive passion, respectively, while Mishkin offered the alternative of maintaining innocence through some form of spiritual grace that transcended social conditioning. But the novel's deepest concern was with the psychological dynamics of beauty, desire, and destruction. Nastasia Filipovna's extraordinary physical beauty had made her simultaneously powerful, and victimized men desired her obsessively, but also resented their desire, leading to relationships that combined worship with the urge to destroy what they worshipped. Her beauty had become a burden that isolated her from authentic human connection, creating a psychological condition where love and hatred became indistinguishable. Mishkin's response to Nastasia represents one of literature's most complex explorations of how perfect love might function in practice. His feelings for her transcend sexual desire or romantic infatuation. He sees through her defensive manipulations to the wounded child beneath, responding to her suffering rather than her beauty. But this very purity of motivation creates new problems, making her feel simultaneously understood and judged, loved and condemned by comparison to his moral superiority. Dostoevsky's notebooks reveal his struggle to balance Mishkin's saintly character with psychological believability. He must be completely innocent, but not naive, wise, but not worldly, loving, but not weak. How is such a combination possible? Only through suffering that has purified rather than corrupted. But what kind of suffering produces such results? The answer lay in creating a character whose psychological development had been shaped by illness and isolation rather than social interaction. Mishkin's years in Swiss sanatoriums had protected him from the compromises and corruptions that normal social development required, allowing him to maintain childlike openness while developing adult intelligence. His condition made him simultaneously more and less than normal human beings, more spiritually developed, but less practically competent. Working on The Idiot during his European exile, Dostoevsky found himself increasingly isolated from Russian intellectual life, while becoming more acutely aware of what he saw as Western European spiritual bankruptcy. Dresden's material prosperity seemed to him like a beautiful facade hiding moral emptiness, much like the aristocratic society Mishkin would encounter in St. Petersburg. The novel became partly a meditation on whether authentic spiritual values could survive in societies organized around material success and social competition. The gambling addiction that continued to plague him during this period provided unwitting research into the psychology of self-destruction that informed characters like Nastasia and Rogozin. The compulsion to risk everything valuable for the momentary excitement of potential loss seemed to him like a metaphor for how sophisticated people sought intensity through activities that they knew would ultimately destroy them. Beauty, gambling, passionate love all represented ways of escaping the numbness of secure existence, even at the cost of that security. And his role in supporting his literary work while managing their increasingly desperate financial situation gave him insight into how innocent people could be damaged by their association with more complex personalities. Her genuine love and practical competence were constantly tested by his psychological difficulties and self-destructive behavior, creating a real-life parallel to Mishkin's relationship with the more tormented characters who both needed and resented his goodness. The novel's tragic conclusion, Mishkin's final mental breakdown after failing to save Nastasia from Rogozin's destructive passion, reflected Dostoevsky's growing pessimism about whether pure goodness could survive in a world organized around competition, desire, and self-interest. Perfect love might be the highest human possibility, but it was also the most vulnerable, likely to be destroyed by the very corruption it sought to heal. Yet, The Idiot was not simply a pessimistic work. By creating a character whose goodness was absolutely authentic, Dostoevsky had demonstrated that such moral perfection was imaginable, even if it proved unsustainable in practice. Mishkin's existence, however brief and tragic, served as a standard against which all subsequent moral compromises could be measured. The novel suggested that knowing what perfect love looked like was valuable, even if achieving it proved impossible. As he completed the final chapters in early 1869, Dostoevsky understood that he had pushed psychological realism into territory that few readers would be prepared to follow. The Idiot demanded emotional and intellectual engagement that conventional fiction did not require, asking readers to consider moral questions that had no comfortable answers. It was simultaneously his most ambitious artistic achievement and his least commercially successful novel. But the experiment had taught him something crucial about the relationship between art and spirituality that would inform his subsequent masterpieces. Literature could serve as a form of moral laboratory where ethical questions could be explored through psychological experimentation. Characters could embody philosophical positions and test them against human reality in ways that pure philosophy could never achieve. Fiction had become a tool for spiritual investigation as much as artistic entertainment. Chapter 9. Demonic Possession, Switzerland, 1870. In his notebook, Dostoevsky sketches the psychological profile of a man he will call Nikolai Stavrogin, character so morally complex that creating him feels like summoning a demon into existence. The notebook entry reads, "A man who contains all possibilities, capable of the highest nobility and the deepest corruption, often simultaneously. He experiments with evil not from passion, but from curiosity. He commits crimes not because he must, but because he can. What would such a soul look like from the inside?" This question emerged from Dostoevsky's growing obsession with a particular type of modern personality that seemed to be emerging in Russian society, individuals whose sophisticated intelligence had led them beyond conventional moral boundaries, who treated ethical questions as intellectual problems to be solved rather than sacred truths to be honored. These were not traditional criminals acting from ignorance or desperation, but educated nihilists who had reasoned themselves into believing that moral law was arbitrary human convention with no absolute foundation. The inspiration for Demons, originally titled The Possessed, came partly from newspaper accounts of the Nechayev affair, a political conspiracy involving young revolutionaries whose ideological commitment had led them to murder a fellow conspirator. But Dostoevsky's interest focused less on the political dimensions of the case than on its psychological implications. How did rational individuals convince themselves that murder could be justified by abstract political theory? What psychological processes allowed intelligent people to transform criminal impulses into ideological conviction? Stavrodin, the novel's central character, would represent the logical endpoint of this psychological development, someone whose intellectual sophistication had completely severed the connection between understanding and feeling, knowledge and conscience. He would be capable of performing both noble and terrible acts with the same emotional detachment, treating moral choice as aesthetic experiment rather than spiritual commitment. Creating such a character required Dostoevsky to access aspects of his own psychology that he preferred not to acknowledge. During his revolutionary period, he had experienced moments when political conviction seemed to justify activities that personal morality would have condemned. The mock execution and Siberian exile had forced him to confront his own capacity for self-deception, his ability to rationalize destructive impulses through elaborate intellectual justifications. But Stavrodin would be more than autobiographical projection. He represented a social type that Dostoevsky believed was becoming increasingly common in modern European civilization, the individual whose education had provided sophisticated tools for analysis without corresponding development of emotional or spiritual wisdom. Such people could understand human behavior with scientific precision while remaining fundamentally alienated from authentic human feeling. The technical challenge was creating a character whose moral emptiness could sustain reader interest across a novel's length. Traditional narrative psychology assumed that characters were driven by desires, conflicts, and goals that readers could recognize and empathize with. But Stavrodin would be motivated primarily by intellectual curiosity and aesthetic boredom impulses that could lead to dramatic action, but not to the emotional involvement that usually sustained literary engagement. Dostoevsky's solution was to surround Stavrodin with characters who were psychologically dependent on him, who projected onto his moral emptiness their own need for meaning, purpose, and spiritual authority. The novel's dramatic tension would emerge not from Stavrodin's internal conflicts, he was too psychologically detached for authentic inner struggle, but from the way his influence corrupted others who mistook his sophistication for wisdom. This dynamic reflected Dostoevsky's observations about how charismatic nihilists could attract followers despite offering nothing positive to believe in. The absence of conventional moral commitment could appear like freedom to people trapped in circumstances that felt restrictive or meaningless. Stavrodin's ability to act without apparent moral constraint would seem enviable to characters who felt paralyzed by ethical confusion or social convention. The novel's political dimension emerged naturally from this psychological foundation. Revolutionary movements attracted people seeking escape from moral uncertainty through commitment to causes that promised to simplify complex ethical questions. Political ideology provided ready-made answers to spiritual problems, offering the appearance of meaning without requiring the painful personal development that authentic spiritual growth demanded. But Dostoevsky's treatment of revolutionary psychology was more nuanced than simple conservative critique. Many of the novel's radicals were motivated by genuine moral outrage at social injustice, authentic desire to alleviate human suffering. Their error lay not in caring about political change, but in believing that external social transformation could address problems that were fundamentally spiritual in nature. Shigalov, the novel's most systematic revolutionary theorist, articulates the logical conclusion of rational social planning, perfect equality achieved through absolute despotism, individual freedom eliminated in favor of collective efficiency. His vision represented what Dostoevsky saw as the inevitable endpoint of purely secular approaches to social organization systems that treated human beings as material to be organized rather than spiritual beings with transcendent dignity. Writing Demons required Dostoevsky to inhabit psychologically the minds of characters whose worldviews he found morally repugnant. The creative process became a form of spiritual investigation, exploring how attractive ideas could lead to destructive conclusions, how noble impulses could be corrupted by intellectual pride, how the desire for certainty could justify the elimination of uncertainty through violence. The novel's treatment of Kirillov, the engineer who commits suicide to prove human freedom from God, represented Dostoevsky's most direct engagement with atheistic philosophy. Kirilov's logic was impeccable. If God does not exist, then human beings are absolutely free to define their own values, and the ultimate expression of this freedom is the choice of death over life. His suicide becomes a philosophical statement rather than an emotional act, the final proof that consciousness is not subject to any external authority. But the novel suggests that such philosophical consistency comes at the cost of psychological authenticity. Kirilov's intellectual commitment to absolute freedom requires him to suppress natural human desires for connection, meaning, and continuity. His rationalism becomes a form of self-torture that is ultimately indistinguishable from the religious fanaticism he rejects. The character of Shatov provided a counterpoint to the novel's nihilistic characters, someone whose experience of political extremism had led him back toward traditional religious faith rather than away from it. His declaration that the people is the body of God represented Dostoevsky's own evolving understanding of how spiritual truth might be preserved through cultural tradition rather than individual philosophical investigation. But even Shatov's religious conviction is presented as psychologically complex rather than simply positive. His faith emerges partly from genuine spiritual insight and partly from emotional need for certainty that pure reason cannot provide. The novel suggests that both faith and atheism might serve psychological functions that were independent of their truth value, that people believed what they needed to believe in order to maintain psychological coherence rather than what evidence actually supported. Dostoevsky's notebooks reveal his struggle to balance the novel's political themes with its psychological investigations. The political events are only symptoms of deeper spiritual crisis, but the spiritual crisis manifests through political action. How can fiction represent both levels simultaneously without losing narrative focus? The answer lay in creating characters whose political convictions were inseparable from their psychological needs. The novel's revolutionaries were not simply misguided idealists, but individuals whose personal histories had prepared them to be attracted to movements that promised to resolve through collective action the spiritual problems they could not solve individually. Working on demons during the Franco-Prussian War, while observing European civilization apparently destroying itself through rational application of military technology, Dostoevsky began to see the novel as prophetic rather than simply critical. The psychological patterns he was exploring in his characters seemed to be manifesting on historical scale. Entire societies were being organized around principles that treated human beings as means rather than ends, that valued efficiency over dignity, that sought to solve spiritual problems through material means. The novel's conclusion, with Stavrogin's suicide and the dispersal of his followers, suggested that nihilistic philosophies were ultimately self-destructive, that consciousness could not long sustain complete detachment from moral commitment without destroying itself. But the destruction was not simply negative. It cleared ground for new possibilities, new attempts to find authentic foundation for human meaning and social organization. As he completed Demons in 1872, Dostoevsky understood that he had created his darkest and most challenging work, a novel that pushed psychological realism into territory that most readers would find disturbing rather than entertaining. But he also sensed that he was approaching the artistic and spiritual insights that would inform his final masterpiece. The investigation of nihilism had revealed what human beings could not live without. Now, he needed to explore what they might live for. Chapter 10. Brothers in Crisis. Staraya Russa, 1878. In his study overlooking the Palast River, 57-year-old Fyodor Dostoevsky sits surrounded by theological texts, legal documents, and philosophical treatises, preparing to write what he knows will be his final masterpiece. The room smells of pipe tobacco and samovar tea, of paper and ink, and the particular staleness that accumulates around a mind that has spent decades wrestling with ultimate questions. On his desk lies a letter from his publisher, asking for delivery dates. But time has become elastic for Dostoevsky. He is no longer writing to meet deadlines, but to complete a spiritual investigation that has consumed his entire adult life. The Brothers Karamazov began as an attempt to synthesize everything he had learned about human psychology, moral philosophy, and spiritual possibility during 4 decades of literary exploration. But the novel's immediate inspiration was intensely personal: the death of his son Alexei from epileptic seizures in 1878. The child had lived only 3 years, inheriting his father's medical condition along with, Dostoevsky believed, his spiritual sensitivity. Watching another innocent die had reopened questions about divine justice that had tormented him since his mother's death in childhood. The novel would center on three brothers whose different approaches to existence, rationalist, sensualist, and spiritual, would represent the major philosophical options available to modern consciousness. Ivan, the intellectual, would embody pure rational analysis, pushed to its logical conclusion. Dmitri, the soldier, would represent passionate engagement with immediate experience. Alyosha, the youngest, would explore whether religious faith could provide adequate foundation for authentic spiritual life in an age dominated by scientific materialism. But the novel's emotional core would be the murder of their father, Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, a character Dostoevsky based partly on memories of his own father and partly on his understanding of how patriarchal authority could become corrupted into pure exploitation. The father's death would force each brother to confront his own capacity for hatred, his own relationship to violence, his own responsibility for evil that he had wished for but not directly committed. This murder mystery would provide the novel's external structure, but its deeper concern was with the spiritual murder that modern culture was committing against traditional sources of meaning and value. Each brother represented a different response to this cultural crisis: Ivan's tortured atheism, Dmitri's desperate hedonism, Alyosha's struggling faith. Their father's actual murder would serve as objective correlative for the symbolic patricide that modernity was committing against all inherited forms of spiritual authority. Creating Ivan Karamazov required Dostoevsky to give his most powerful artistic expression to atheistic philosophy that he personally rejected. Ivan's rebellion against God was not based on lack of evidence for divine existence, but on moral revulsion at a universe that permitted innocent suffering. His famous declaration, "I won't accept God's world," represented the strongest possible case against religious faith, articulated by someone whose intellectual sophistication made simple refutation impossible. The Grand Inquisitor chapter, Ivan's philosophical poem about Christ's return to medieval Spain, became Dostoevsky's most complex exploration of the relationship between spiritual truth and institutional religion. The Inquisitor's argument that human beings are too weak for the absolute freedom that Christ offers, that they need authority, certainty, and comfort, rather than the terrifying responsibility of authentic choice, reflected Dostoevsky's own doubts about whether genuine Christianity was psychologically sustainable for most people. But Ivan's intellectual brilliance comes with devastating psychological cost. His rational analysis of evil leads him to a moral paralysis that makes him indirectly responsible for his father's murder. His servant Smerdyakov commits the actual crime partly because Ivan's philosophical conversations have convinced him that everything is permitted if God does not exist. Ivan's tragedy is not that his reasoning is flawed, but that pure reason, unsupported by faith or love, becomes a destructive force that consumes both thinker and those influenced by his thinking. Dmitri represents the opposite extreme, someone who lives entirely through passion and impulse, who experiences good and evil as immediate emotional realities rather than abstract philosophical problems. His relationship with money, women, and violence reflects the psychology of someone who has never developed adequate internal controls over his desires, who swings between extremes of nobility and degradation without achieving psychological integration. Yet Dmitri's very emotional intensity makes him capable of authentic spiritual transformation in ways that Ivan's intellectual sophistication prevents. His experience of being falsely accused of murder forces him to confront the difference between legal guilt and moral responsibility, between what he has done and what he has wanted to do. His eventual acceptance of suffering for crimes he did not commit becomes a form of vicarious atonement that has genuine spiritual significance. Alyosha, the youngest brother, represented Dostoevsky's most direct attempt to create a positive spiritual hero without falling into the sentimentality that had weakened the idiot. Alyosha's faith is not naive innocence, but hard-won conviction that has survived exposure to the same intellectual and emotional challenges that destroy his brother's spiritual peace. His relationship with the elder Zosima provides him with spiritual guidance that is psychologically sophisticated rather than simply pious. But even Alyosha faces moments of spiritual crisis, particularly when Zosima's body putrefies rapidly after death, instead of remaining miraculously preserved as traditional Russian Orthodox believers expected. This apparent absence of divine intervention forces Alyosha to choose between faith, based on miraculous confirmation, and faith, that can survive the absence of supernatural proof. His choice to maintain spiritual commitment despite disappointment represents mature religious conviction rather than childish dependency on divine reassurance. The novel's treatment of childhood through the character of Ilyusha and his schoolmates revealed Dostoevsky's growing understanding of how adult spiritual crises originated in early psychological trauma. Children's natural capacity for love and wonder could be destroyed by exposure to cruelty, cynicism, and adult moral failure. But the same experiences that traumatize some children might strengthen others, depending on whether they encountered authentic spiritual guidance during crucial developmental periods. Writing The Brothers Karamazov required Dostoevsky to synthesize insights from his entire literary career while pushing beyond previous achievements toward unprecedented artistic complexity. The novel needed to function simultaneously as murder mystery, philosophical treatise, spiritual autobiography, and social critique while maintaining narrative momentum across nearly 900 pages of text. His method involved creating multiple layers of meaning that operated independently while reinforcing each other. The murder investigation provided popular appeal, the philosophical debate satisfied intellectual readers, the spiritual themes addressed existential questions, and the social criticism engaged contemporary political concerns. Each layer was complete in itself, but gained additional significance through relationship to the others. The novel's Russian Orthodox Christianity was not simple traditionalism, but sophisticated engagement with modern intellectual challenges to religious faith. Dostoevsky understood that authentic spirituality in the modern era required confronting rather than avoiding the strongest arguments against religious belief. Ilyusha's faith was credible precisely because it had survived exposure to Ivan's atheistic reasoning rather than developed in isolation from intellectual challenge. Working on the novel during the final years of his life, Dostoevsky was increasingly aware that he was racing against time to complete his artistic and spiritual testament. His epileptic seizures were becoming more frequent and severe, his gambling addiction continued to create financial and emotional crises, and his health was deteriorating under the accumulated stress of decades of psychological intensity. But this awareness of mortality gave special urgency to his artistic work. The Brothers Karamazov needed to contain everything he had learned about human nature, everything he wanted to communicate about the possibility of authentic spiritual life, everything he understood about the relationship between individual psychology and cultural crisis. It was simultaneously his masterpiece and his spiritual last will and testament. As he worked through the novel's final chapters, describing Ilyusha's speech at Ilyusha's funeral about the possibility of resurrection and eternal life, Dostoevsky felt that he was approaching artistic and spiritual insights that justified everything he had suffered and learned during his tortured but productive life. The novel would stand as testimony that consciousness could survive ultimate crisis, that meaning could be found in the deepest suffering, that love was a real force in the universe, despite all evidence to the contrary. The completion of The Brothers Karamazov would represent not just artistic achievement, but spiritual victory, proof that someone who had experienced the fullest possible range of human possibility could still affirm life, still choose hope over despair, still believe that existence was ultimately meaningful rather than absurd. Chapter 11, Epileptic Visions, January 1881, St. Petersburg. Fyodor Dostoevsky stands before his writing desk, but the familiar objects, inkwell, manuscript pages, the small icon of Christ that had accompanied him since Siberia seemed to pulse with otherworldly significance. The pre-epileptic aura has begun, that strange state of consciousness that he both feared and treasured, when ordinary reality became transparent and some deeper level of existence revealed itself through the fabric of everyday experience. He had learned to recognize the signs decades earlier, the peculiar brightness that seemed to emanate from within objects rather than shine upon them, the feeling that every sound carried meaning beyond its literal content, the sense that the boundaries between his consciousness and the external world were dissolving. Medical texts called it pathological neural activity, but Dostoevsky knew from direct experience that these moments contained insights unavailable to normal awareness, glimpses of harmony, beauty, and meaning that justified the suffering that inevitably followed. The seizure, when it came, lasted only minutes, but the recovery required hours, during which consciousness slowly reassembled itself from fragments of memory, sensation, and confusion. Anna found him collapsed beside his desk, having struck his head against the corner during the convulsion. As she helped him to bed, murmuring reassurances while checking for injuries. He tried to explain what he had experienced during those moments of altered awareness, but language seemed inadequate for describing states of being that transcended ordinary mental categories. "Everything was light," he whispered, his voice still slurred from the seizure's aftermath. "Not visual light, but the light that makes vision possible. And I understood not with thoughts, but with my entire being that suffering is not meaningless, that every pain serves some purpose in a design too vast for normal consciousness to comprehend. I felt connected to everyone who has ever lived, everyone who will live, all of us part of something so beautiful that if people could see it clearly, they would weep with joy rather than despair." These epileptic visions had shaped his literary work more profoundly than any external influence. The mystical experiences provided direct access to states of consciousness that he then spent months attempting to recreate through language, trying to translate ineffable spiritual insights into psychological portraits that readers without such experience might find credible. Characters like Prince Mishkin and Alyosha Karamazov carried traces of this visionary awareness, their spiritual sensitivity derived from his own neurological condition transformed into artistic material. But the epilepsy was not simply a source of artistic inspiration, it was also a constant reminder of human vulnerability, of how quickly consciousness could be disrupted, of how dependent mental life was upon fragile biological processes. The same condition that provided glimpses of transcendent meaning also demonstrated the material basis of all mental activity, creating a paradox that informed his understanding of the relationship between spirit and body, soul and brain. His notebooks from this period reveal ongoing attempts to articulate the philosophical implications of epileptic experience. If consciousness can be altered by purely physical event, seizures, illness, injury, then what does this mean for our understanding of spiritual reality? Are mystical insights simply neurological illusions? Or do neurological events sometimes permit access to levels of reality usually hidden from normal awareness? The question had practical urgency because his seizures were becoming more frequent and severe as he aged. What had once been occasional interruptions to normal life now occurred several times per month, each episode leaving him weakened and confused for days afterward. The accumulated damage was visible in his increasing difficulty with memory, his occasional struggles to find appropriate words, his growing inability to sustain the intense concentration that literary creation required. Yet paradoxically, these signs of mental deterioration coincided with his greatest artistic achievements. The Brothers Karamazov, written during a period when his epilepsy was becoming increasingly debilitating, represented the culmination of his literary development, proof that consciousness could produce works of lasting beauty in as the brain that housed it began to fail. The novel's spiritual insights seemed to emerge from rather than despite his neurological condition, as if approaching mortality had clarified his understanding of what mattered most about human existence. The relationship between his epilepsy and his gambling addiction revealed another dimension of how neurological condition shapes psychological behavior. The pre-seizure state of heightened awareness often included feelings of supernatural luck, as if the same altered consciousness that provided spiritual insights also granted temporary omniscience about future events. These feelings made gambling irresistible during certain neurological phases, creating a connection between medical condition and self-destructive behavior that he understood intellectually but could not control emotionally. And his diary entries from this period document the complex challenge of living with someone whose genius was inseparable from pathology. After his seizures, Fyodor becomes like a child, gentle, wondering, full of love for everyone and everything. But these beautiful states are always followed by depression, irritability, and sometimes cruel treatment of those who care for him most. I have learned to treasure the gentle periods while protecting myself during the dark ones, but the cycle never becomes easier to bear. This pattern, mystical insight followed by psychological crash, reflected broader rhythms in Dostoevsky's creative process. His greatest literary achievements emerged from periods of intense suffering, when epileptic seizures, financial crisis, gambling losses, and emotional turmoil created conditions of psychological extremity that forced consciousness to operate at maximum capacity. The novels were not escapes from suffering but transformations of suffering into meaning, demonstrations of how human consciousness could find purpose in the most difficult circumstances. His correspondence with friends and family during 1880 and early 1881 reveals growing awareness that his time was limited. The epileptic seizures were accompanied by other health problems, respiratory difficulties, cardiac irregularities, circulatory problems that suggested his entire nervous system was deteriorating. But rather than depression, this recognition produced a kind of spiritual urgency, a desire to complete his artistic and philosophical testament before consciousness itself was extinguished. The famous speech about Pushkin that he delivered at the dedication of the Pushkin Monument in Moscow, just months before his death, represented his final public statement about literature's spiritual mission. Before an audience that included Russia's most distinguished writers and intellectuals, he argued that authentic art served as bridge between material and spiritual reality, that great literature revealed transcendent truths that purely rational investigation could never discover. The poet's mission, he declared, is not to entertain or even educate, but to make visible the invisible connections that unite all human experience. Through imagination and empathy, literature can show us that we are not isolated individuals struggling alone against meaningless circumstances, but participants in a cosmic drama where every choice matters, every suffering serves some purpose, every life contributes to a pattern too vast for any single consciousness to comprehend completely. The speech was received with extraordinary enthusiasm. Critics called it one of the most moving literary statements ever delivered, but for Dostoevsky it felt like a farewell rather than a triumph. He had finally found language to articulate insights that had emerged from decades of epileptic visions, and the articulation felt like completion, as if his artistic mission had been fulfilled through making explicit what his novels had demonstrated implicitly. Returning to St. Petersburg after the Moscow triumph, he began experiencing what Anna called the gentle epilepsy, seizures that were less physically violent but more spiritually intense, producing extended periods of altered consciousness during which he seemed to exist in direct contact with sources of beauty and meaning that normal awareness could not access. During these episodes, he would speak about characters from his novels as if they were real people he had known intimately, describing their spiritual development with the precision of someone reporting empirical observations. Alyosha is growing, he told Anna during one such episode. His faith is deepening as he encounters more of life's cruelty. Someday, he will understand that love is not feeling but action, sentiment but commitment to serve others regardless of personal cost. Ivan is also progressing, though he doesn't realize it yet. His rational rebellion against God is preparing him for authentic faith, the kind that emerges not from need for comfort, but from recognition that existence itself is miraculous. These conversations revealed how completely his fictional characters had become independent psychological entities with their own developmental trajectories. The epileptic visions were showing him not just spiritual insights, but the continued evolution of consciousnesses he had created through literary imagination. Art had achieved a form of reality that transcended its material origins, creating spiritual beings that could continue growing even after their creator's biological death. As winter deepened and his seizures became more frequent, Dostoevsky began preparing for an ending that felt simultaneously natural and unimaginable. The same neurological condition that had provided his greatest spiritual insights was slowly destroying the brain that housed them, creating a final paradox that seemed characteristic of his entire existence: consciousness approaching transcendence precisely as it faced extinction. Chapter 12. The Final Seizure. January 28, 1881, 30 p.m., St. Petersburg. Fyodor Dostoevsky sits in his study, working by lamplight on notes for what would be the sequel to the Brothers Karamazov, a novel he will never write. The room is warm against the bitter Russian winter, filled with the comfortable domestic sounds of Anna preparing tea in the kitchen and their children playing in the adjoining room. At 59, he has finally achieved something resembling peace: financial security from his literary success, a stable marriage, a routine that accommodates both his medical condition and his creative needs. The manuscript pages before him contain sketches for Alyosha Karamazov's continued spiritual development, plans for exploring how religious faith might function in an increasingly secular world. His handwriting, once precise and controlled, has become a regular sign of the neurological deterioration that has been accelerating over recent months. But his mind remains sharp, capable of the psychological insights that have made him one of literature's most penetrating analysts of human motivation and spiritual possibility. He pauses in his writing to examine a letter that arrived that morning from a young woman seeking advice about maintaining faith despite intellectual doubts. Such correspondence had become frequent since the publication of The Brothers Karamazov. Readers found in his work a kind of spiritual guidance that they could not locate elsewhere, seeing him as someone who had wrestled with ultimate questions and emerged with insights worth sharing. The responsibility felt both honored and burdensome. How could someone whose own spiritual certainty remained fragile offer definitive answers to others' existential crises? The letter's specific question concerned the problem of evil. How could a benevolent God permit innocent suffering? The young woman had lost her child to disease and found herself unable to reconcile this loss with religious teaching about divine love. Her anguish reminded Dostoevsky of his own spiritual crises following his son's death, his mother's tuberculosis, the mock execution that had nearly destroyed his faith in anything beyond brute material existence. As he began drafting his response, drawing upon decades of wrestling with the same questions, he felt the familiar preliminary symptoms that preceded his epileptic seizures. The room's lamplight began to acquire that peculiar intensity that marked the onset of altered consciousness, and ordinary objects seemed to pulse with significance that extended beyond their material properties. He had learned to recognize these warning signs, to prepare for the disruption that was approaching. But tonight's seizure felt different from the thousands he had experienced throughout his adult life. Instead of the usual progression from heightened awareness to convulsive unconsciousness, his consciousness seemed to be expanding rather than fragmenting, encompassing broader perspectives on existence than normal mental functioning could contain. The boundaries between his individual awareness and some larger pattern of meaning were dissolving, but gently, without the violent disruption that usually characterized his epileptic episodes. He managed to call out to Anna, who found him standing motionless beside his desk, his face transformed by an expression she had never seen before, not the typical confusion of post-seizure states, but something that seemed almost like recognition, as if he were seeing something long anticipated finally revealing itself. His breathing was shallow but regular, his pulse rapid but steady. Medically, his condition appeared stable, but psychologically, he seemed to be existing in a realm beyond ordinary consciousness. "I can see it all now," he whispered, his voice carrying the wonder of someone discovering treasure that had been hidden in plain sight. The pattern that connects everything, every suffering, every joy, every choice, every consequence. It's not that pain doesn't matter, but that it matters in ways we can't understand while we're trapped in individual perspective. Everything serves the larger design, even the things that seem purely destructive. Anna helped him to the bed, recognizing that this episode required careful monitoring rather than medical intervention. His previous seizures had taught her to distinguish between neurological events that posed immediate danger and those that simply needed to run their course. Tonight's experience seemed to belong to the latter category, but its intensity and duration were unprecedented. For the next several hours, Dostoevsky drifted between normal consciousness and states of mystical awareness that provided access to insights he had pursued throughout his literary career. The characters from his novels seemed to visit him during these periods, not as creations of his imagination, but as independent spiritual entities whose existence had transcended their fictional origins. Raskolnikov appeared to describe his continued psychological development in some realm beyond the novel's conclusion, while Prince Mishkin spoke about the gradual healing of his damaged consciousness through divine love. "Alyosha is here too," he told Anna during one lucid interval. "He wants you to know that faith is not belief despite evidence, but recognition of evidence that normal consciousness is too limited to perceive. The spiritual realm is not separate from material reality, but is material reality seen from adequate perspective. Everything we call supernatural is simply natural law operating at scales too vast for individual minds to comprehend." These conversations revealed how completely Dostoevsky's artistic creations had achieved independent psychological existence. Decades of imaginative identification with fictional characters had created a form of multiple consciousness that survived the breakdown of normal mental boundaries during extreme neurological events. His epileptic visions were not simply random neural activity, but organized experiences involving personalities that had developed through literary creation into genuine spiritual entities. The seizure's aftermath extended through the following day, with Dostoevsky experiencing alternating periods of profound clarity and complete confusion. During the clear moments, he dictated final messages to family members and close friends, offering spiritual insights that seemed to emerge from direct contact with transcendent reality rather than intellectual speculation. During confused periods, he appeared to be conducting conversations with people who had died decades earlier: his mother, his father, fellow prisoners from Siberian exile who had not survived their sentences. Anna documented these final conversations with meticulous care, recognizing their significance as testimony from someone who had spent a lifetime exploring the furthest reaches of human psychological possibility. He speaks about death, not as ending, but as transition, she wrote. Not escape from life, but completion of it. Not relief from suffering, but transformation of suffering into understanding that makes all previous pain meaningful. On January 28th, as evening approached, Dostoevsky experienced what would prove to be his final moment of normal consciousness. He asked Anna to read aloud from the Gospel of Matthew, specifically the passage about Christ's temptation in the wilderness. As she read the familiar words about choosing spiritual rather than worldly values, his face showed the same expression of recognition that had characterized his seizures, but now peaceful rather than intense. "The Grand Inquisitor was wrong," he said, referring to the philosophical centerpiece of the Brothers Karamazov. "Human beings are not too weak for spiritual freedom. They are too afraid. Fear makes us choose certainty over truth, comfort over growth, security over love. But fear is illusion. What we call death is simply the moment when consciousness recognizes its true nature." These were his last coherent words. The massive hemorrhage that ended his life occurred during the early hours of January 29th. While he slept beside Anna in the bed they had shared for 14 years. The medical cause was listed as pulmonary edema complicated by epilepsy, but for those who had witnessed his final spiritual experiences, the death seemed less like biological failure than like consciousness finally achieving the transcendence it had been seeking throughout 6 decades of intense psychological exploration. Anna found him at dawn, his face peaceful in a way it had rarely been during life. The chronic tension that had characterized his features, the expression of someone constantly wrestling with ultimate questions, had been replaced by what appeared to be complete serenity. Death had not conquered him, but had released him into the spiritual reality that his epileptic visions had permitted him to glimpse, but never fully enter while consciousness remained trapped in biological constraints. The news of Dostoevsky's death spread rapidly through St. Petersburg's intellectual community, creating shock that extended beyond normal grief for a distinguished author. Readers understood instinctively that they had lost not simply a talented writer, but someone who had served as spiritual guide through the psychological complexities of modern existence. His novels had provided maps for navigating moral territory that seemed increasingly treacherous as traditional certainties collapsed under pressure from scientific materialism and political revolution. The funeral, held at Alexander Nevsky Lavra, drew crowds that exceeded anything previously seen for a Russian author. Students, workers, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens stood together in frigid winter weather to pay respects to someone whose literary work had addressed their deepest spiritual needs. The diverse gathering demonstrated how completely Dostoevsky had transcended normal social boundaries, speaking to universal human experiences that united people across class, education, and political affiliation. But perhaps the most significant tribute came from the young woman whose letter about faith and suffering had been on his desk during his final seizure. Learning of his death, she wrote to Anna, "I never received his answer to my questions, but somehow no longer need it. Knowing that someone understood my anguish so completely that he devoted his entire literary career to exploring it, that knowledge itself provides the comfort I was seeking. He showed us that asking ultimate questions is more important than finding final answers, that spiritual struggle itself is a form of faith." This recognition captured something essential about Dostoevsky's achievement. His greatness lay not in providing definitive solutions to existential problems, but in demonstrating that such problems could be explored with psychological honesty and artistic beauty. His characters' suffering was authentic rather than sentimental, their spiritual insights earned rather than imposed, their human complexity irreducible to simple moral categories. As his coffin was lowered into the frozen ground of Tikhvin Cemetery, mourners understood that they were burying someone who had changed literature's relationship to spiritual questions. He had proven that fiction could serve as serious investigation into ultimate reality, that psychological realism could reveal truths that purely rational analysis could never discover, that artistic imagination could access forms of knowledge unavailable to scientific materialism. The epileptic seizure that ended his life had been, in one sense, simply the final episode in a neurological condition that had tormented him for decades. But in another sense, it represented the culmination of a lifetime spent pushing consciousness to its limits, seeking direct contact with transcendent reality through willingness to endure whatever psychological extremity such contact required. St. Petersburg, 1981. On the centennial of Dostoevsky's death, readers around the world gather to commemorate an author whose influence has only deepened with time. In Soviet Russia, despite official literary doctrine that reduces his novels to symptoms of pre-revolutionary spiritual crisis, underground readers pass dog-eared copies of the Brothers Karamazov between trusted friends, finding in Ivan's rebellion against God a voice for their own questions about justice and meaning under totalitarian rule. In Western universities, philosophy students discover that his psychological insights anticipate existentialist themes by decades. In psychiatric hospitals, therapists recognize in his character portraits the most accurate literary depictions of mental states that clinical texts struggle to describe. The persistence of his relevance across cultural and political boundaries suggests that Dostoevsky succeeded in exploring psychological territory that transcends historical specificity. His character's spiritual struggles speak to universal human experiences: the encounter with meaningless suffering, the difficulty of maintaining moral commitment without absolute certainty, the longing for authentic community in societies organized around competition and self-interest. These concerns have proven as relevant to readers living under capitalism, socialism, and fascism as they were to 19th-century Russian aristocrats and intellectuals. But his influence extends beyond individual psychology into collective analysis of how societies succeed or fail in addressing spiritual needs that purely material progress cannot satisfy. The 20th century's political catastrophes, totalitarian regimes that promised rational social organization while producing systematic cruelty, democratic societies that achieved unprecedented prosperity while generating widespread spiritual emptiness, vindicated his insights about the relationship between ideas and behavior, theory and practice, conscious intention and unconscious motivation. The Russian Revolution, occurring 36 years after his death, seemed to follow patterns he had explored through characters like Shigalov and Peter Verkovensky. Idealistic intellectuals committed to alleviating human suffering through rational social reorganization created systems that inflicted suffering on scales that traditional autocracy had never achieved. The contradiction was not accidental, but logical attempts to solve spiritual problems through political means inevitably led to treating human beings as material to be organized rather than spiritual entities deserving respect. His analysis of revolutionary psychology proved equally applicable to fascist movements that emerged in Western Europe during the 1930s. The attraction to ideology that promised simple solutions to complex problems, the willingness to sacrifice individual conscience to collective purpose, the transformation of humanitarian sentiment into justification for cruelty. These patterns that he had explored through fictional characters manifested historically with terrifying accuracy. Yet Dostoevsky's legacy is not primarily prophetic warning, but diagnostic insight combined with therapeutic possibility. His characters who descended into psychological hell sometimes emerged with understanding that helped them discover authentic spiritual foundations for human meaning and community. Their journey suggested that spiritual crisis might be a necessary stage in authentic spiritual development rather than simply destructive experience to be avoided. This perspective has proven especially relevant for readers living through cultural transitions where traditional sources of meaning have lost credibility without adequate replacements emerging. His exploration of how consciousness might maintain dignity despite ultimate uncertainty offers guidance for individuals trapped between worldviews they cannot accept and alternatives they cannot yet envision. Contemporary psychology has validated many insights that Dostoevsky developed through artistic intuition rather than clinical observation. His understanding of how guilt functions as both destructive and potentially redemptive force anticipates theories about shame, self-punishment, and moral development that academic psychology systematized decades later. His recognition that psychological sophistication could coexist with emotional immaturity prefigures current understanding of how cognitive and emotional development proceed independently. His influence on psychotherapy has been particularly significant. Therapists working with patients whose symptoms emerge from spiritual crisis rather than personal trauma often find that his novels provide better guidance than medical texts. Characters like Raskolnikov and Ivan Karamazov illustrate how psychological healing might require addressing ultimate questions about meaning, responsibility, and transcendence, rather than simply eliminating symptoms through pharmaceutical intervention or behavioral modification. But perhaps his most important contribution to contemporary culture has been demonstrating that spiritual investigation can proceed through psychological honesty rather than requiring abandonment of intellectual integrity. His character's religious insights emerge from authentic encounter with suffering, doubt, and moral complexity rather than from naive acceptance of traditional doctrine. Their faith, when they achieve it, is earned rather than inherited, chosen rather than assumed, maintained despite rather than because of intellectual certainty. This achievement has encouraged contemporary readers to explore spiritual questions without feeling obligated to choose between rational skepticism and irrational credulity. Dostoevsky's example suggests that the choice itself might be false, that consciousness can develop forms of spiritual insight that satisfy both intellectual honesty and authentic religious need, that faith can be based on psychological truth rather than historical evidence, that transcendence might be discovered through rather than despite complete engagement with human complexity. The technical innovations that made such balanced exploration possible, particularly his development of polyphonic narration that allowed multiple perspectives to coexist without authoritative resolution, have influenced how literature approaches controversial subjects. Writers have learned from his example that artistic technique can serve philosophical investigation, that literary methods can explore questions that discursive argument cannot adequately address, that fiction can be simultaneously entertaining and spiritually serious without becoming either propagandistic or preachy. His global influence reflects the universal applicability of insights that emerged from specifically Russian cultural circumstances. Readers in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and other regions have discovered that his psychological analyses transcend cultural boundaries, while his spiritual concerns address questions that arise wherever traditional certainties collide with modern intellectual development. The underground consciousness he explored appears in societies undergoing modernization regardless of their particular religious or political traditions. Yet this universality does not eliminate the specifically Russian dimension of his achievement. His novels captured something essential about how Orthodox Christianity might maintain relevance in an increasingly secular world, how Russian spiritual traditions might address challenges that Western European intellectual development had created, how Slavic psychological patterns might offer alternatives to rationalistic approaches to human problems. The continuing vitality of his influence more than a century after his death suggests that he succeeded in creating literary works that function as permanent spiritual resources rather than historical documents. New readers continue to discover in his novels insights that illuminate their own experience, guidance for psychological problems that pure reason cannot solve, evidence that consciousness contains possibilities for growth and transcendence that external circumstances cannot eliminate. His characters remain alive in ways that most fictional creations do not. They continue developing in readers' imaginations, continuing to wrestle with questions that each generation must answer anew. Raskolnikov's guilt, Ivan's rebellion, Alyosha's faith, Mishkin's love. These psychological realities transcend their narrative contexts to become permanent elements in human understanding of spiritual possibility. The hospital where his father worked among society's most vulnerable members, the prison where he learned about human nature under extreme pressure, the epileptic seizures that provided glimpses of transcendent reality, all of this suffering was transformed into literary art that helps subsequent generations understand their own encounters with pain, injustice, and mystery. This transformation represents his ultimate achievement, proving that consciousness can discover meaning in the deepest suffering, that artistic creation can serve spiritual investigation, that individual psychological development can address collective cultural problems. The wounded healer became the healing wound, someone whose damaged life produced insights that continue to offer guidance for others struggling with similar spiritual challenges. His legacy suggests that the choice between reason and faith, science and spirituality, individual fulfillment and social responsibility might be false alternatives, that consciousness capable of embracing complexity can discover forms of understanding that transcend such conventional oppositions. The questions he raised continue to require answers, but his example demonstrates that seeking authentic answers is itself a form of spiritual practice that can transform both seeker and society. The lamp burns low in a St. Petersburg garret, exactly as it did on that January night in 1881 when Fyodor Dostoevsky set down his pen for the final time. But the light has not gone out. In reading rooms and coffee shops, in prison cells and university libraries, in the quiet moments when modern consciousness confronts its own underground depths, his characters continue their eternal conversations about guilt and redemption, reason and faith, the possibility of love in a universe that seems designed for suffering. We return to them because we recognize ourselves in their struggles. Ivan Karamazov's rebellion against divine justice echoes in every heart that has witnessed innocent suffering and demanded explanation from silent heavens. Raskolnikov's descent into guilt speaks to anyone who has discovered the gap between theoretical conviction and actual experience, between what we think we want and what we actually need. The underground man's self-destructive intelligence resonates with every consciousness that has learned too much for its own peace, that has analyzed itself into paralysis, that has chosen the intensity of misery over the numbness of contentment. But we return to them also because they discovered that human nature contains possibilities that suffering cannot destroy, that consciousness can maintain dignity under conditions designed to eliminate it, that love might be more than sentimental illusion or evolutionary strategy. Their psychological journeys map territory that each individual must explore personally, the descent into spiritual crisis that sometimes leads to authentic spiritual discovery, the encounter with meaninglessness that can awaken appreciation for authentic meaning, the acceptance of uncertainty that might be the foundation of a genuine faith. Dostoevsky understood what many of his contemporaries did not, that the modern era's elimination of traditional religious certainties was not simply intellectual loss, but spiritual opportunity. The collapse of inherited faith created space for faith that was chosen rather than assumed, earned rather than inherited, maintained through struggle rather than protected through isolation. His characters who achieved spiritual insight did so by engaging completely with doubt rather than avoiding it, by accepting psychological complexity rather than seeking simple answers. This insight remains as relevant today as it was in 19th century Russia. Contemporary readers living in societies that have achieved unprecedented material prosperity while generating widespread spiritual emptiness find in his novels guidance for navigating similar contradictions. His exploration of how consciousness might discover authentic meaning despite intellectual sophistication that has eliminated naive certainties speaks directly to spiritual challenges that purely secular culture has not adequately addressed. The questions he raised through his characters' psychological experiments continue to require answers that each generation must discover anew. How does one maintain moral commitment without absolute certainty? How does consciousness preserve hope despite intimate knowledge of human cruelty? How does love survive in competitive societies that seem designed to reward selfishness rather than compassion? These questions have no final answers, but asking them authentically might be more important than finding comfortable solutions. Dostoevsky's ultimate gift was demonstrating that spiritual investigation itself has value independent of its conclusions, that the search for meaning might be more meaningful than any particular meaning discovered. The underground voice that began by declaring, "I'm a sick man," continues to speak for everyone who has recognized their own sickness while refusing to abandon hope for healing. The wound that produced such beautiful art reminds us that consciousness contains resources for transformation that no external circumstance can eliminate. In our darkest moments, we can still choose to become the authors of our own redemption. The lamp flickers but does not die. The questions endure. The search continues.